Stay positive. Yeah, exactly. She's on her way.
Enjoy your bagel.
Okay.
Discuss selection bias.
We have IT people here.
What?
Do we have IT people here?
Excuse me?
Do we have IT people here?
No, I have their number. In Josh, it also didn't work. There's a mouse. At least she called you. I was thinking,
Yeah.
Well, I could attest to the presence of the traffic.
Yeah.
you could.
Get some coffee. I don't know that there's any left, actually.
No, there's two. I mean, isn't?
Is she staying far?
No,
She
she.
said she thought she was back in there.
Where are you putting her up?
No, it's in the near the Embarcadero. There's a facility there that's the best price.
Next time we'll have them stay at my place.
You could bring them in.
Bring them in my.
Okay, Maria.
I haven't made anybody.
Don't anymore let her use her computer unless she wants to get into the other things. Okay?
Can you, okay, so this has an automatic,
What?
it's
No,
moving automatically, right?
No, it's not.
Oh, really? It seemed like it was.
I thought you were pushing it.
No.
No, I didn't put a slideshow. I just put, slide. Or
Start it, see if it goes automatically. I think it does.
Is it possible for the data set to be sent as a CSV for the non-SAS users?
Do you have?
No, I only have what's in the Dropbox. She gave that to me.
Oh.
So someone has to change it or whatever.
Super easy. We just export it to CSV, and then I can import it.
Okay, so
Right
you
now
want,
it's a SAS file.
Yeah.
gotta be
I can
in
try to do it.
If someone has SAS. someone
I don't
can
have
export
SAS,
it.
but I have stat transfer. I think.
ask Audrey maybe, but to
Anyone
give
who
it
has
to
SAS
me.
can
Anyone
do it.
can give it to me, you know.
I'm sure I'm not the only person.
Have stats on their file who can export the data set as a CSV file or stat transfer. I can try this. Crystal can do it. Yes, okay, we don't volunteer.
And then give it to me and I'll put it back in the Dropbox.
Thank you very much.
Okay? Well, see, it's not moving, Maria.
Oh, okay, no, it's just me.
Okay.
That's not on view. Start this show.
View slideshow.
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Escape. Darn it. Zara. Zara, do me a big favor. Zara. Oh, do me a big favor.
She put up what she had of yours. If you want to switch it out, we can switch it out, but she put up whatever you said.
Yeah, I can have a message about it. It's the same price, but it just the PowerPoint version of it.
Okay.
And then, oh, I actually need to do it for my laptop.
Okay.
So,
Back up.
no, that's totally fine.
Okay. Let's see what kind of thing you have.
Yeah, so I guess you can, one of these. Yeah, I think it's probably better.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, you find your file, I will find how to plug it in.
Oh, okay, all right.
That's like, I think that's gonna be the best.
Okay.
Thank you. Perfect.
So it'll just project there, it won't be here, right? It'll just be there.
Yeah, it does. This doesn't matter now. We can just turn this off.
Okay,
I think.
just wanted to make sure.
Sorry.
And it's just. Oh, okay.
Great. All right. Okay, this is. Okay, I think you can put that in your pocket or clip it anywhere you want. Or you can also use this one, I think, if you prefer. I don't know what you do there.
Yeah, I think clipping is probably better.
Okay, I like that better. Yeah.
Is there a like a pointer or anything, or?
That's a good question. What is this?
Oh, there. Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right, you ready?
Yeah.
Welcome. How did the data set go? Welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Chanelle Howe. And first we welcome her by introducing her to San Francisco practice. And now we're hoping to have a warmer welcome where we talk about selection bias. Dr. Howe is an assistant professor at Brown. I was looking at her training background and realized it's like basically a who's who of excellent public health training programs with a little bit of an East Coast bias. Dr. Howe started at MIT and did her undergraduate there, then went to Columbia for her master's, and went to Hopkins for her PhD, where she did a PhD in Epi and a master's in biostats, and subsequently did postdoctoral training at University of North Carolina. So she is known for her methodologic work, and particularly on selection bias, and I think this particular invitation was sparked when we read one of your papers as a journal club paper, and it instigated a lot of debate among the faculty. I think we mostly have consensus now, but we're excited to hear you settle the issues. She actually, I noted, since I lecture my students all the time about choosing outcomes, I also I like to admit when I'm proven wrong. Chanelle has two funded R01s that she's NPI of. One is on multi-level risk and resilience factors in cardiovascular health, and the other is resilience in addressing racial disparities in adverse HIV-related outcomes. So all the lectures that I've given you about choosing a domain outcome, proving that it's not necessary. So, with no further ado, thank you very much.
Okay.
We can take a break, kind of whenever you're ready to take a break.
Sounds good. So thank you, Maria, and thank you, everyone, for coming today. I wasn't sure how many people would actually show up, so I'm glad it's not an empty room. So as Maria said, I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about selection bias, going over some concepts, some definitions, some tools. All of this isn't new. Some of it's new, some of it's tweaking of things, and some of it is foundational as well. So these were the three papers that I recommended. I wanted to not overwhelm you too much, and two of which I published, and then one by Miguel. But these papers rely on so many other papers, so many other foundational papers, especially Miguel's 2004 paper. And so I'm going to include additional references throughout, but these are the ones that I thought were most related to what I'm going to talk to you about today. Just so you know, anyone who's ever seen me talk, sometimes I can talk very quickly. So if I say something too fast, you don't understand me, just definitely chime in and say, hey, pump the brakes, I'm not following. And I'm used to that. And these slides basically come from two lectures that I give in my course. So it's pretty easy to put this together and come on out. And then I made some tweaks to introduce some newer stuff that I've recently published. So these are some of the other references that I cite that I think are important, and of course including this Hernan and Robbins causal inference book that has a lot of the background material That's based on things that they've previously published and other people have published as well. So you can, I'm assuming that you guys have seen this book, but again, it's a good book to look at. So just the main objectives, there's two parts. First is basically just to use causal diagrams to simply characterize selection bias. And I will say that I present this very differently. I've never seen anyone else present this the way that I present it. And it's built off of work from my postdoc with Steve Cole, as well as my dissertation with Alvin Munoz, focusing on informative censoring. So I've been thinking about this issue for maybe like 15 years now. And so all of it, I believe, to be correct, but it's very, it's not always explicit, or it's like tweaks and things like that. So hopefully this will be novel for many of you. And then the second part is to talk about some tools that you could use to minimize selection bias. Some of these tools you're probably already familiar with, and I'll provide a little bit more detail, and focusing on both the design and the analysis. And I think a lot of times when methodologies speak, they focus a lot on the fancy methods, and that's great, but the fancy methods don't do anything if you don't have the necessary data collected, right? And so that's been a big part of my more recent work, trying to emphasize that and talk about the importance of the design. Because if you have a good design, you can do the simplest analysis ever. So I'm going to take some time to talk about that as well. And so let's get started with part one. So the first couple slides will focus on the structure, the direction, and the magnitude of selection bias. Because I took this from my normal advanced epi methods course, there is some notation in here that my students usually I introduce prior to this lecture, and you obviously haven't been introduced to this lecture. So if there's some notation that you don't follow, just jump in and let me know if you find something to be confusing. I find the notation actually be quite helpful. And I use diagrams throughout like more than half of this. So this assumes that you have some basic understanding of the rules of causal diagrams, but if something comes up that's a little confusing, then definitely, again, chime in and let me know. So I define selection bias, again, sort of like no one else defines it. The only person who gets me in this context is Steve Cole, because I trained with him, and he's my postdoc mentor. And so we came up with this way of defining things that's a little bit different that I thought to be really helpful. So in the 2016 paper, we coined the term absolute and relative selection bias, essentially. And so absolute selection bias is a bias that arises from how participants are selected into and out of a given analysis sample. And by absolute, it means it's not a comparative. It's just like what biostatisticians like to call the one sample problem, where you're focusing on just getting, let's say, the hazard or survival estimate for a particular population. You're not comparing it to anybody else. You just want to know what portion of people have HIV in some group or something like that. And then there's the relative selection bias, which is comparative. So you're getting maybe a hazard ratio, a risk ratio, and an odds ratio, and you're comparing two or more groups. And I think this distinction is really important, and I tried to make the case in that 2016 paper, because when they're biased, it isn't always the same setting, right? So that's why it's good to focus on distinctly. And I started thinking about absolute selection bias because my dissertation was focused on the one sample problem, just estimating survival in the informative censoring setting. And a lot of the literature just focused on the comparison, and that was not applicable to what I was doing. So I thought it was good to, have a definition and put it out there. So we're going to focus first on absolute in-selection bias in the context of, let's say, a cohort study. And this can happen, let's say, if you have missing data or people don't participate, like in your study. You say, hey, come participate, and they say, no, I'm good, and they never let you know. Or, it's a self-selection type of bias or a volunteer bias, because people who volunteer for studies aren't necessarily a random sample of some underlying target or source population. And so the simplest definition is the sample population. This can happen because it's not a random sample of the source. So you have some source population where you go to sample from to participate in your study, and you want to get an estimate. And so that sample you get isn't a random sample of that source population. And just because it's not a random sample doesn't automatically equal bias, but it's a source of bias. And so a term that Miguel has coined is saying you can have selection without bias, right? It's not the same thing. And so here I have lambda to represent just the hazards, let's say in the source and the sample population, and it's indexed by K because there's a hazard over time, essentially. And so let's say we're in this world where we have this particular causal diagram, where let's say we have some exposure, some covariate L, an indicator of whether or not you're included in the sample going from the source to the sample population, and then the outcome YT, and I have YT here because Y is an indicator of having the outcome, and T is the time from some origin to the event. So I do this in a time to event framework for various reasons. So let's say for this structure, let's say the people who are more likely to be sampled have some value of covariate L. And also people who have that covariate L value are also more likely to have the outcome. So there's some, based on this diagram, an association between who's sampled and who is in the outcome, who has the outcome. So maybe people who are sampled are more likely to be sicker, and sicker people are more likely, let's say, to die if that's the outcome. Then you're going to have a higher, let's say, hazard of death in your sample than you would have in the source population. And that's essentially represented here, where the hazard in the source is not equal to the hazard in the sample, essentially. Now for this diagram, even though you have absolute in-selection bias, you don't have relative. And I'll talk a little bit about that more. But you don't have relative bias, meaning that your hazard ratio in the sample as well as in the source should be, let's say, the same, essentially. Because A is completely independent of any other covariate in the system or in the causal diagram, essentially. Now, if you tweak the diagram and say that A is actually related to the outcome, not only do you have absolute in-selection bias in this case, and I'm calling this in-selection because it's sampling into the cohort study that you're doing, let's say. And, but you can also have out-selection, and that has to do with people exiting, right, the cohort study that you're doing. So again, we came up with that language just to help with the distinction because the methods are actually a little bit different. So in this case, you have some in-selection bias, and you not only have bias of the absolute measure, but also of the relative measure, but under certain situations. So how this diagram stumped me for a really, really long time, and in that 2016 paper, there's simulations, and it was like, oh, I'm not really sure. And then going back to the Standard Greenland paper that was published in the 70s, as well as Miguel's AJE paper that talks about that as well, that was part of your sign reading. The reason why this can essentially happen is because let's say that you now are interested in some exposure. So in the prior diagram, I always had A as an exposure, but there's no, for the absolute measure, there is no exposure. You're getting it for the whole population, right? So for the relative measure, there is some exposure A. And so in each arm of A, there is some selection bias going on in terms of who A represents in the sample compared to the source, essentially. And those people get into your study population. So in a world where the selection bias is identical between the exposed and the unexposed, they should just cancel each other out and there shouldn't be any bias. But if they don't cancel out in terms of the extent of the bias, meaning let's say the bias goes up in one direction and down in the other, or it goes up to 1 degree but goes up to a lesser degree in the other, then they're not going to cancel and you're going to have some bias. So the setting where that actually can happen is when there's an interaction between the exposure and other determinants of the outcome of interest in terms of their joint effects on the outcome, right? And so essentially this line right here, if for one level of A it's missing and present for another level of A, that's interaction. Or for one level of A, it has, let's say, a hazard ratio of 2, and another level it has a hazard ratio of 3. That's another type of interaction, right? And so the degree, the magnitude, and potentially the direction of the selection bias is going to be conditional on A. So when you compare the exposed and the unexposed people, the extent of the biases are not going to cancel in the two arms. But if they're identical, then they will cancel in the two arms. And that took me, I thought about this problem for like 5 years. He's like, I don't get it. I'm seeing this in simulations. I don't know what is going on. And at some point, Steve Colton was like, we need to move on with our lives. Just document it, give a general idea what you think is going on, and have somebody else figure this out. But apparently, Sander Greenland figured it out in 1970. But I just couldn't find that paper. And I remember presenting this at SER, and I think Maria was in, and both Jeff, we were in the room too. And, Miguel gets up and he's like, yeah. And he's like, there's some papers, da-da-da. And I like spent months trying to find these papers and couldn't find it. I mean, so it was like the biggest secret of my life, essentially, until I finally had the aha moment. And I was like, yes, I must run out and tell everybody in the world. And that's why I'm here. Because this is actually really important, essentially, because everyone thinks that, and you read so many papers, I would say 95% of the literature says if the diagram looks like this, more or less, you don't have bias. And that's actually not true. So does that make sense? Like, this is like the most important slide in this whole workshop, frankly. So if you have questions, please let me know. Yes and no. So when I was trained, and I guess I was learning DAGs at the very end, and everyone was like, you can't represent interaction or effect modification in a diagram. And I was like, okay. And then Tyler wrote this paper in 2009 and said, you kind of can. And that's the paper he made the distinction between effect modification and interaction. So you kind of can. So in this diagram, you can't have interaction between two variables unless, at least for one level, or one level of some other variable, that there's an arrow that goes from one variable to the other and the second variable to the outcome, right? So that's why in this diagram, you will never have relative selection bias because A does not cause the outcome. So there is no possible way for A and L to interact with each other. Like, this has to be somehow related to the outcome in order for interaction to be present, right? But it's not. So again, one of those big epiphanies, like after like pulling out my hair for like years. And I've documented in simulations, and I've gone back and checked and said, oh, actually, because when I remember emailing with Jeff about this, because he had his own epiphany, and it was like, what's going on? And he's like, what about the simulations that you did? And I went back and looked at them, and on one scale, when I simulated this DAG, there was no interaction between A and L in terms of their outcome. But if you have interaction on one, if you don't have it on one scale, you have to have it on the other. So it was on the scale I hadn't simulated it on, and I went and checked, and it was there, and it was really strong. So you're always going to have it if there is some. The only way you wouldn't is if A doesn't cause the outcome at all in this diagram. Yes?
So don't you think that the real issue that we missed all this, it isn't because of the failure of DAGs to demonstrate the potential for interaction, but it's because the reading and the subsequent publicity of the 2004 paper was one of a deterministic, without collider bias, there is no selection bias. Wasn't that the universal interpretation of the paper, and then for basically a decade we were all blind?
Yeah, so when I was working on that 2016 paper, and I remember you being in the audience and coming up after me after I gave this talk, and Miguel was one of the discussants. And yeah, I mean, this was an issue I've had for years with that 2000. I think that 2004 paper is fantastic. That paper blew my mind, changed my life. But while concurrently working on my dissertation, I always was saying, why are we never focused on the one sample problem where we're just trying to get an absolute measure of something? This is so focused on the two sample problem, like a lot of this literature, even though we do care about the one sample problem in epi. And so I think because we are so focused on estimating relative measures, we don't think about what's going on with other things. And so because we focus on relative measures, and because that paper was focused on under the null for the causal diagram, you didn't have to discuss absolute bias at all. And so it got ignored. And that 2004 paper became like a Bible for selection bias in many ways, and people moved on with their lives. And I always felt like, oh, I want to write a paper. That's where the 2016 paper came out. Like I said, we need to be talking about both of these things, because just because the relative effect is bias doesn't mean that the absolute. And frankly, I feel like a lot of people's table ones are probably have biased results because they don't care about the absolute measure. Table 1 is basically your absolute measures for that whole population. So I think that to just my mission to like write this paper, and then I started seeing nuances that I had never seen before that other people had published, but it was varied, it was hard to understand. I went back and looked at places and I was like, I had no idea what Pearl or Greenland or whoever I was talking about. And so one of the spaces that I operate in is like, I call myself a bridge person, right? Where I have the biostat training, where I can actually understand the method literature, but then show examples of it and show, you know, more applied examples, because you can talk about things theoretically and abstractly, but when you have particular things in front of you with a few nuances, all sorts of things creep up that nobody even knew existed for a method. And so this is an example of that, where stemming from my own dissertation work and thinking about this for a long time, and then saying, wait, we need to pump the brakes, even though what had been presented was correct. And then that 70 paper by Greenland just got buried, and I guess no one read it or understood it, or and that's why last year, so 2 years ago, I was a visiting faculty member at Harvard, and Miguel was my sponsor, and at the time, there was like some anniversary issue at AJE, and he was asked to write a commentary on that 70 paper, right? Because there were people writing commentaries on all these big old school papers, and so he was like, yes, because it's a big, big misconception, essentially. So that's how that paper, so I'm so glad that he had wrote that to get it out, but I'm not even sure people are actually reading that paper, frankly. So yeah, long story short, I think it's because people focus on the relative estimate, and then in that paper it was specifically under the null, and didn't really tell anybody, essentially. And I think that's been an issue in the causalistic literature in general, in my opinion, where all these really smart people write papers, and there's a lot under the hood that they don't explicitly say, and then people go to apply it and fall off a cliff, essentially. And so one of my missions is to help people not fall off cliffs. Because I fall off many cliffs, trying to do this work and having panic attacks, waking up with sweat in the middle of the night, like, what? You know, and constantly emailing Miguel, Tyler, et cetera, saying, is this what you meant? Is this what you meant? Like, stalking them to make things more explicit, and then writing my papers making it more explicit, essentially. Yes?
Oh, there's no bias here, there's not a problem.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if is that a limitation of people's typical understanding of causal diagrams in DAGs, or is that maybe this just isn't an issue that's good to represent with causal diagrams in DAGs? Maybe like why is a DAG useful for this situation if it does, the rules don't necessarily tell you where to follow?
Well, there's a lot of stuff in the DAG that are not explicit.
Yeah. So then why put it on a DAG?
Because that's one of the best tools we have to represent our entire knowledge.
Yeah.
So, I think that it's really important to clarify what the target population is for the random. So in this case, is it explicitly the target population is the cohort, the source, not the people in the sample?
Yes.
This was one of the major sources of debate, because
Never a debate in my mind.
in my view, very often you actually care about just the people in the sample. Like, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say.
So I actually don't agree with that. I think people say that, but I don't think that's true, right? Because, first of all, if that was true, then why do we have confidence intervals? Why do we have sampling variability statistics, right? Because recommend we have taken another sample, how will it vary, right? So that's like a whole bunch of statistics that get developed because of random error, right? So I think we all are interested in, I think a lot of times people say, oh, well, in the sample it's fine. I'm like, but you didn't do this study just for the sample. And you may not, it's kind of like this backup plan, right? So I actually, your comment I get all the time. And my response is, if we only wanted to draw, you know, inference to just this population, you grab 5 people off the street, get their values, and be done. We wouldn't have any sampling variables, in my opinion, right? We wouldn't calculate confidence intervals for that, because that is the truth, that's it. I mean, maybe you could say if we had sampled these same exact people again in time or something like that, well, that's usually not what we're talking about. We're talking about we want to make inference to men. We grab some men off the street. How representative are these men off the street to everybody we wanted to make inference? And so that's why I usually push back in that regard.
This may be why you separated survival versus sampling in selection versus down selection.
Yeah.
So there's an argument that the people that you care about, the causal effect for are the people who remain alive.
That is true.
But you separated these topics, and maybe that's why.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I try not to, death is a whole other thing, like this competing risk thing, and so that's why in that 2016 paper, we focus just solely on loss to follow. And in the concept of loss to follow, it is the people who were lost and the people who stayed, who we want to make insurance to, not just the people who stayed.
Depends on the setting, but I agree typically.
Okay.
But the answer to this, to this question here, that doubted the utility of DAGs because most people would see this as not a problem. Do you not think that that is just, it stems from just a completely narrow view of collider bias from the 2004 paper? It isn't DAGs, it's not the rules. So we learned the rules too narrowly until you brought them to our attention.
Yeah, I mean, I get it, but I think that, you have to filter and you need to focus on the most pressing problem. And I agree that this is a pressing problem, but maybe at that time that was, what they felt was most pressing, just to get things out there, because you can't write, a full book on this, to be published in epidemiology. But yeah, I remember there's a lot of stuff in terms of selection bias that's under the hood that I'll talk about today. That, every time I bring it up to the guy, he's like, yeah, we knew that 20 years ago. But I didn't know that, and so I think there's only so much you can present. So they have redefined the field, right? But they can't do everything, and I think, the onus is on others who follow to help clean up some of the loose places where other people don't realize it. So while I think that, the 2004 paper may have been more comprehensive if they did the setting under the null and not under the null. That paper was a pretty dense paper already. Okay, so now that I've made this point, I'm going to move forward. So this is the more classic structure. Again, we're focusing on absolute and relative selection bias. So here, this is under the null. So in this setting, for this structure, you end up with selection bias because the example is the collider here. So that's pretty straightforward. And then it's also biased here if it's not under the null. Now we're switching over to out selection bias. So the DAGs look identical, except here now, selection corresponds to dropouts or not dropping out, right? So you're making inference to the people who didn't drop out, and as I said to you earlier, I do actually want to make inference to the people who I don't have data for, because this is a different problem, right? So same structure, just a different node. So again, for this structure, just only absolute selection bias. For this structure, we get absolute and relative selection bias. For this structure, we get absolute and relative selection bias. And for this structure, we get absolute relative selection bias. And then the bullet point I have up here is that the dropouts, what I mean by selection bias in this context is that the dropouts are not a random sample of all individuals in the set at the time of dropout, which is different than saying that it needs to be a random sample of people at the origin at the beginning of the study, right? So of the people at the time of dropout, when it happens, the people who leave, who drop out, are not representative of people who stay. That was like the focus of like 5 years of my dissertation about this topic. So, and I view the processes being different. So yeah, but the diagrams look very similar. So a couple of extra points that I think are made in the Herman and Robbins textbook are that, and I kind of tweak it, is that under the null, relative selection bias can only occur when you have a collider, essentially. But not under the null, well, sorry. Okay, yeah, so for that diagram, and then it also can happen, you add a line, it's not under the null here, but you can also have, so not under the null, where you have an arrow from the exposure to the outcome, you can have bias when the collider is present, and you can also have bias when the collider is not present. And that was one of the big points I tried to make. This issue alone, I think, is the reason why my paper was published in HAE, just to make this point. So the next couple of slides focus on the direction of absolute selection bias. So I use It's funny, I've like been using sign diagrams before like people really started publishing papers on sign diagrams, so kind of using it a little bit. So this is a little bit of use of it, but I'm keeping it simple because it's still intuitively correct. So let's just focus on the sampling and dropout node and the outcome node and the covariate. So if we're thinking about the direction of, let's say, absolute selection bias. So if having L makes you more likely to be in the sample to not drop out, that's represented by the plus. And it also makes you more likely to have the outcome, then you would expect that, let's say, the hazard in the sample would be higher than the hazard in the source, right? So people, again, let's say this is like, whether you're sick or not, so sicker people are more likely to be sampled or not drop out, and they're also more likely to have the outcome, then the hazard of the outcome is going to be higher than the sample. And the same is true if you flip it where they're both negative, where if they're less likely, people who are sick are less likely to be sampled and also less likely to have the outcome. And again, who remains in the sample is going to be people who are more likely to have the outcome. Now, if there are different signs where people who are sicker are more likely to be sampled but also less likely to have the outcome, then the hazard in your source population is going to be hazard higher than it is in your sample. So similar to predicting direction of confounding bias, these simple rules that we use for since the start of my PhD program, they may fail when you have more complex diagrams, so I wouldn't really get carried away with this. And frankly, I sort of have this general policy that I'll tell you about in a second. But essentially, these simple rules don't really always work in more complex diagrams or when the variables are not dichotomous. And there hasn't been much work in terms of predicting direction in this situation where we're under the null and we have these common causes here in terms of predicting direction. And one thing I wanted to highlight, going back to trying to predict the direction when you have a collider and you're interested in some relative selection bias. Just to refresh your memory, and I use this example, I kept changing it in my course to choose but this is an example of like classic collider stratification bias constantly presented throughout the literature. How I learned it in 2004 and I keep going. So let's say that you have some exposure A and some outcome Y. And then exposure A is an indicator of whether or not someone had a crash, and the outcome Y is whether someone had a car accident. And they both predict whether or not someone is hospitalized. So let's say you live in a world where the only way you could be hospitalized is if you were in a ski crash or in a car accident, right? We're looking at extremes where like neither one, they don't happen concurrently, right? So if you know someone is hospitalized and they didn't have a ski crash, then you automatically know they had a car accident, right? And the reverse is true. So you end up with this inverse relationship between A and Y. So that's how I first learned about why collider stratification bias happens, why there's an association between A and Y. So what I didn't really think about until years later was that in order to really say that there's this inverse association between A and Y, there's this implicit assumption that having A or Y were sufficient and necessary for the inverse association to happen, right? However, if you needed both A and Y, not either A or Y, right, then actually you would end up with a positive association between them, right? It would be in a different direction than you actually thought. And you actually don't know which world you're in, whether it's positive or a negative association. Usually, I mean, let's just move some data. But you don't really know what world you're in. Usually depends on, maybe it could depend on some undiscovered background factor you, essentially, that determines that, but you don't know you because it's undiscovered. And so actually, like, reason about which situation you're in, you could use sufficient causation structure to do this. And so Tyler and Jamie have a paper that came out a long time ago that I didn't read, and I'll tell you why. So, called direct and track, probably is sufficient. Anything with sufficient causes I don't like. because it gets like hard to understand. And I'm going to email Tyler because he's done quite a bit of work in this area. I was like, Tyler, is there any way to reason the reflection, about the selection bias? And he's like, yeah, there's this paper, right? He's like, what? It doesn't really help. I was like, well, I'm not going to read it then. So you just totally demotivated me to read it. So I'm not lying, I've never read this paper, but it's in my lecture slide. Just to make this point. It's not very helpful, right? And so for a long time, after he said that, I said, you know what, I'm never going to try to predict the direction for selection bias. I'm just going to say, is it present or is it not? If you read every single one of our papers, with one exception, and that's the most recent paper, I do not predict the direction. So I'm like, I can't even be bothered with this. Like, it exists or it doesn't, and that's it, right? However, this is the exception. And this is a paper that I recently published with Whitney Robinson on survival-related selection bias and studies of health, racial health disparity studies. And the reviewers were like, I need you to predict the direction. Come on. And I was like, come on, I don't want to. So then I simulated it and then predicted it and it was done. So that's like the only exception. But I try not to. And I understand the inclination why people want to, because it's part of a sensitivity analysis to say, are we in the right direction? How much does things have to change the direction, flip things? I totally get it. But I still am like, I don't want to. But this is the situation that I have done it in, and I do with simulations. And I also sometimes encourage people to look at the appendix, because there's code for that simulation to tweak it, so you could perhaps do it as well if you don't want to mess around with this paper sort of like myself, and you're sort of forced to. And I know, I just saw the other day that I think Tyler, and I think it's his PhD student, who actually tried to had a paper now on sensitivity analysis, so Jeff, you may want to look at this, because we talked about this like a year ago, where they present some closed form equations to basically assess the magnitude and direction. So I actually have not read the paper, I only came across it in the last week. So, and I think it's part of AJE, at the preview, like where they post the manuscript without the copy editing, so it's probably the most recent one, so you can take a look. But I don't know if that paper is going to change my life or not. I might just still say it exists or not, but we'll see once I go through that paper. So this part is about the magnitude, which is pretty simple and straightforward. If anybody else has anything special, they definitely chime in. So again, the same structure under the null. So for absolute selection bias, in order for it to be really strong, it requires a strong association between the sampling mechanism and the outcome. So basically, this arrow needs to be pretty strong, and this arrow needs to be pretty strong. And you got to have a lot of selection, right? And I've done a lot of work in terms of simulation, and I shouldn't be saying this because I'm about to be on a panel with Maria trying to make a case for why selection bias is the worst bias in the world when I actually don't believe it. Because I do what I'm told. It's because you got to have a lot of selection, and it's got to be really strong. And even papers that I've read for other people in their simulations, and they have a lot of bias. When you start to look at the parameters that they put in, you've got betas of like 35, and you're like, in what world do we have a beta of 35? So I actually don't think selection bias. It makes me kind of sad because I've spent like 15 years of my life thinking about a bias that actually probably doesn't matter that much. Like confounding, I think, matters a lot more than selection bias and measurement error does. But the selection bias is fun to think about. Yes.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, we've got plenty of examples in, we call it problems with retention, selection and retention. We've got plenty of situations where we have gone after, and maybe you're familiar with this work, random sample of the non-retained, and then reincorporated that the outcomes in that randomly sampled non-retained population, and we find the analytic estimates, which you're calling relative, to be vastly different.
Because you probably lost a lot of people, right?
I don't know, no more than usual.
No, but what is your usual? Because you think coincidentally you got a lot of dropouts.
The standard 15, 25% kind of thing.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm shocked. by that, because my examples, as well as my simulations, indicate otherwise. But I mean, I don't know if you want to chime in, Maria, give me your thoughts.
I think it depends a lot on how big of an association that you care about.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, I thought about this more in the context of collider bias and selection, but
Yeah.
for that, I think it's really hard to induce off a big difference. But, you know, if you think about, like, genetic epi, they should be worried, and because they're looking for really small effect size. So I think it just depends. If you're only interested in something that has an effect size of, you know, a huge effect size, then it's probably not your biggest problem.
Right, I was just going to say I need to consult y'all for my debate for the talk.
Am I debating against you?
Yeah, I
Am I
forgot what
picking
your
up something
area
else
is. You might be doing confounding.
Exactly.
No, but you guys make good points. It's just in a lot of my examples, and I talked to Steve about this, and I'm like, this doesn't even matter. And here I am getting up, making a case, and feeling embarrassed, and showing an example where the results don't change that much. And people are like, really, Chanelle? So I've had it happen so many times that maybe I'm just like, I'm undercutting myself. But I will talk to you guys some more about it. Yeah.
So, I run a couple of for the city, and we were almost in particular specificity. We have an integrated database, and there's a huge amount of selection bias. Because we find that the people who are examining, we think that because we have, we put 15 databases into this warehouse, and every high utilizers are called, of all kinds of services, we think we have an incredible sampling range. And then these people are dying, and they're not in our database. So there's a big gap, and some of our, I think for the types of populations that we study that have these complex problems, I think this would actually be really good.
Okay, well, tell me your data, your examples, so I can present them to my section. Like, this matters, because all my examples, it never matters. Yeah.
Well, I think the reason why ours may have a bigger effect is that there's another scheme here to get at this, and that's a direct edge from outcome to sample. Meaning you are not followed up because you die, if death is the outcome. And the systems in place, like where we work in Africa, will not track that big hammer death. And so that probably explains why we've got stronger associations, so we don't go through all the
Yeah, I
judgments.
mean, so anytime death comes in the picture, it's a competing risk problem, and it's like, that's a slightly different issue. Even though we treat death like a censoring problem, it's actually a different issue. So, because you can't possibly have the event after you die. With dropout, you can't. And so it becomes a different problem, so maybe that's why you're seeing something a little bit different. But yes, I mean, there are situations where it can really matter. I've just seen so many situations where it hasn't, that they were a little bit going down pessimistic.
Yeah, death is not a competing event. It is the event.
Oh, it's just like, oh, sorry, it is the event. Okay, it's the event, but you're censoring people for someone because of loss of follow. Okay, I misinterpreted.
Just the edge goes directly from the outcome to.
That causes you to be lost to follow-up. Okay.
That's right, and you're working in a data generating scheme.
Well, in that situation that it is, they're competing, right? If death becomes a censoring variable, then, like death at an early time point becomes a censoring variable, then it is a competing variable. But I guess well, now I'm confused about competing jumping, but yeah, I mean, then if they die because they're censored, but then you don't, they censor because they died, but you don't know they're dead, and then you have to find them.
Yeah,
so,
that's a common scheme.
Yeah,
Vermont
so
says
it's the
itself.
outcome and the censoring mechanism, which just confuses me. But
So you're saying the DAG has the sampling of the consequence of the outcome,
Correct.
yeah,
which I think is a different structure, which causes a huge bias.
okay,
Like, I
yeah,
think that's
yeah,
conditioning.
But
Don't
it's-
condition on the outcome
Yes,
variable
yes.
is like rule number one.
that's
and
true. Yes,
It does
yeah,
have a huge
yeah.
bias.
So
But
it is
it's
a selection
selection.
bias, but it looks different in this diagram. Yeah, and this is one of the classic ones, but there are, like, I guess that diagram looks more like, is that Bergson's bias? Is that Bergson? Or is that?
I would call it the dependent variable, but
Okay.
probably. But that's because I can never remember any proper name biases.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
why I like the DAX.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm following you. But you can.
Just to clarify, you're just saying it's not a big deal when there's no effective exposure on reflection of sampling or.
No.
You're saying under.
I'm
even
saying,
under
given on this
scenario-
diagram, the only way for it to be strong is if this arrow is pretty strong in magnitude and this arrow is pretty strong in magnitude, which may not happen. And also,
But in scenarios, and Jeff, is your scenario the scenario in which there's no plausible arrow from A to drop out?
Yeah, I mean, for his scenario, like, his arrow is like deterministic.
Right.
Like, you die, you are sensitive. Like, there's no discussion. So, yeah, I mean, that's probably a source of it, because that relationship has to be really, really strong inherently, as you described it. But for this one, it doesn't. And oftentimes I don't think it is, just based on my experience. But again, you know, I'm happy to hear other people. Yeah.
I was wondering in your simulation, maybe you know, students use the concept or the concept, because I feel like if the most socially vulnerable are more likely to drop out, and if the large effect in that group,
So that's sort of like this diagram, where this level of A is producing selection. So yeah, so it actually gives a higher bar in this situation, right? Because to have strong selection bias under the null, not only do these arrows have to be strong, but this one has to be strong as well. And so I guess could be a debate about which one is going to be like greater or not, but I think the bar, in my opinion, is probably going to be higher for this, because now you've got three things that have to be strong instead of just two things. And then this will also happen under, well, for this scenario, I have this here basically to say that there hasn't really been a lot of work in this area in terms of the magnitude, but I would be inclined to think that basically the stronger this interaction is, the greater the selection bias is, because as the greater the differential in the two arms, in terms of exposed and unexposed, let's say, then that's, you know, the greater the bit of the bias doesn't cancel. So perhaps it's less a function of the strength of these two arrows, but more the function of the joint effect of A on Y, or A on the outcome and L on the outcome. That's my inclination, but I haven't shown it in the simulation. Yeah. Oh,
I was just thinking about this and what has to happen, because it's like an effect, because it's diluted to whatever extent you're basically doing a weighted average of an effect modifier. So I think it makes sense to me like why it would be
okay.
a side story.
Good.
I think that you guys have different decks.
Yes, we definitely have different decks. I think I'm in agreement about that. And then I just have this as a reminder again that you can use simulation to also assess the magnitude, which is what I've done as well. Sometimes it's hard to, like, these are very simple diagrams. Imagine you have like arrows everywhere. Like, reasoning that is like hard. So sometimes it's good to just do some simulations, see where you're at. And also it's going to vary on the effect measure probably that you're using as well. And that's not readily represented in the diagram, so the simulation can help. So in this appendix, there's code that you can modify, and then Maria has published 2 papers. I think I shouldn't even tell you. I probably did a review on both of those papers.
Those papers?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and they both are published. Like, and I love, you know, all those simulations. And so those are other examples where I think there's code in both of those papers where you could perhaps tweak it and like tailor it for your particular setting. So those are just examples. And then now with this closed form paper that Tyler has with a student at Harvard, then that's another way. Because I don't think that the selection bias sensitivity analysis literature is all that great. I think that confounding sensitivity analysis literature is much better than the selection bias sensitivity analysis literature, so what it's building. And whatever works best for you. I just like it's just really easy to write up a piece of code and just do it and just see it versus like figuring out all this other stuff. So I'm more biased towards the simulation approach, but there's other approaches as well. Yes.
You know, just expand the depending effect estimate right after and the things that where that point was made and the commentary where by Miguel as well that you sent out about differences in the.
Yeah, so I don't remember what point Miguel was making, but in my mind, I just think about collapsible versus non-collapsible measures. I would just inherently assume that there's probably different magnitudes of bias there because the hazard ratio inherently has its own selection bias going on, and then now you're adding more selection bias to that versus, let's say, like a risk ratio or something like that. I don't remember the particular point that Miguel was making, but I think, yeah, like, and also, yeah, like if you're thinking about a risk difference versus a risk ratio, even that I think those differences. That's exactly what he was at.
And then you also made the point that there's ratio.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to add on that.
I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. So, okay. All right, so some other examples of selection bias to the collider stratification bias. A lot of these are basically just taken from the Hernan and Robbins text with some tweaks. But just to show that this problem is everywhere, essentially. So this is a classic example. This is what's called heavily rookie bias. So Maria lumps all these together in her head, I guess. She doesn't remember the names, but I have them here. So this is the healthy worker bias. These all look the same practically in terms of the diagram, but they just have different systems. And these were, for a long time, treating these biases as different things, and then with the diagram you can see they're the same thing, they're the same problem, which is kind of nice. So this example focuses on, if you're looking at, let's say, the factor being exposed to some chemical exposure, and the outcome is death, and this gives condition on, you have to be at work, I guess, to be in the study. And so being at work requires you to have some overall good health, because you're there. So let's say there's some covariate U, that's your good health, that makes you more likely to be at work and maybe less likely to have an adverse outcome. And then the exposure also makes you more likely to be at work. And so given the structure, you're going to have some selection bias. The example that I think about all the time with my work, because I've been doing a lot of causal negation and stuff, is when you're trying to estimate direct and indirect effects. And so I think Steve Cole and Miguel wrote a paper, they wrote a paper in 2004 or something, with the fallibility of direct effects or something like that. And they just basically, that whole paper is about collider stratification bias. And so let's say that you're trying to estimate some total effects and some, let's say, direct effects and some indirect effects. So the total effect is the effect of some exposure A on outcome Y through all pathways. That includes mediators, and also has a direct pathway that excludes some potential mediator interest. So classic causal or classic mediation analysis or effect decomposition, whatever you want to call it, that people have done for years and years and years. A lot of it out of the social science literature usually involves some continuous outcome Y, and say some binary exposure, some binary mediator. And essentially, in this situation, we're assuming there's other boundary exposure outcome. So you fit a model, right, that looks at the relationship between A and Y, where Y is the outcome. You pull off this parameter alpha 1, and that becomes the total effect, right, for the effect of the exposure A on Y. Now you say, okay, I think somebody would go to the example, but now you're saying, okay, now I just want to estimate the effect of this operating this pathway, the direct effect. So you fit the model again, but now not only do you have the exposure A, but you also have the mediator. And you pull up this beta 1, and you're like, oh, that is the direct effect, the effect that's not operating through the mediator. But, as highlighted in that paper by Steve and Miguel, is that if there are confounders of the mediator-outcome relationship, then the mediator becomes a collider, so now beta 1 not only captures this direct effect, but also captures this non-causal pathway as well. And so that's selection bias. So, and then the indirect effect will be biased because sometimes people just take the total effect and put back on the direct effect in this very simple example. And so all of these two will be biased, essentially. So this is just another example of collider stratification bias or selection bias. This other example is from the Hernan and Robbins, which I was kind of like read it for 5 seconds to remember this example. But it's selection bias in the case control study setting. You can ignore this notation, but essentially, let's say you're looking at the effect that postmenopause vaccine use on coronary heart disease, and you do it in the case control setting. So C is an indicator being included in the case control study, so it's conditioned on C. Now, inherently in a case control study, you oversample cases. It's usually done in outcome rare, so you're oversampling them, so you have a direct arrow from the outcome line to the study. And then, for some reason, in this population, they oversample people with hip fractures. I don't remember why. So you've got an arrow from F to C, and then they didn't know, for some reason, that this postmenopausal estrogen use predicts hip fractures. So now you've got an arrow from A to F, and now you've got selection bias, or collider stratification bias. And so this is the diagram that Jeff, I think, is talking about, which I also called Bergson bias earlier, where the outcome predicts who gets in the study. So I usually think of that in a case control study, but it's, you know, as Jeff described, it is possible, I guess, in a cohort study to have this type of structure as well.
And we don't need edges, we don't need A to F.
No, I mean, yeah, we could ignore that. Like, whatever, there's something in there that's other than Y, essentially.
This is true, but in the bias that I'm speaking of, we don't even need A to F.
Well, there is something that exists in the world, right? Or maybe not. Because you're saying it's death to death or something. But yes, or maybe not. But, or there's some other process, I don't know. But yes, I mean, there's some arrow, there's some pathway, whether it's a direct or indirect in your diagram that exists.
It's what Shahar calls the unipath bias.
Right, I think, so I came up with some data, which I always thought was really sketchy, to deal with your problem, with this conditioning on, because I think Jeff's arguing that even if you don't have A to F to C, if you condition on C.
Oh, you mean that whole arrow is gone, not just F, but the whole line.
Well, F may be there, but there's no connection between A to F.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think the most recent paper that makes that point, I think, is Daniel Westrick in a paper that he did with Sandra Green. I think it's a fallacy, the 2x2 table, and I think he makes that point. So you might want to take a look at that example. All right. And then this is the issue with the hazard ratio. So again, I'm not going to go into the notation. But essentially, again, this is Hearn and Robbins, and this is based on a paper that Miguel wrote that also, like, he presented at SER one year. And I was like, what is going on? You, like, pulled out the rug from under you. Stop doing this. And so, but it's a very good point. So let's say you're calculating, let's say this is the world that you work on, you live in, where you're looking at the effect of heart transplant on death at 2 time points, Y1 and Y2, and there's some U that is a common cause that causes the outcomes to be correlated, right? So let's say now you're just interested in estimating the effect of A on the risk of death overall, right? You calculate the risk ratio, and there should be no bias here, essentially, because you're not conditioning on anything. Whether it's time point just at time point 1 or time point 2 or some combination. But if you were to do this, calculating the hazard ratio, inherently the hazard is what's the probability in the discrete time frame, is what's the probability of having the event at that particular time conditioned on having survived long enough to do the event at that time. So that inherent conditioning is the definition of the hazard in the discrete time setting means that you're conditioning, when you're evaluating, let's say, the relationship between A and Y2, you're conditioning on not having had the event at Y1. And so that conditioning is why the stratification bias. And so Miguel published this paper called the hazard ratio, basically saying that this is a problem, this is selection bias, this is why the hazard ratio is not collapsible. But if your outcome is rare, this is what's an issue, right? So that's where this rare outcome assumption can help get you out of issues. And so I actually, I'm just going to see, try not to estimate hazard ratios ever anymore. And instead estimate the cumulative survival function as a complement of that to get a cumulative rating, because to avoid the selection bias issue. And that's why in that paper, that 2016 paper, we do all this craziness in the back to just get the cumulative rating rather than like a Cox model. Because when I was trying to figure out where that bias is coming from that I couldn't explain for like 5 years, people were like, well, get rid of the hazard ratio, do some other thing, do all this other stuff. And the bias is still there. It wasn't about the hazard ratio. But if you are trying to minimize your bias, then the hazard ratio probably is a place to do it by not using it. You know, to use the Cox model. And then this example, was another one where I've been thinking about, like, in the back of my mind for like 5 years, like doing health security work, and I'm like, you know, thinking, and then like Tyler wrote this paper with Whitney in 2014 about selected populations, and thinking, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, almost all our health security studies past and early life exposure studies, if we studies of selection bias that we don't even really think about, and like how much can we actually do about. And it was just like this big aha moment. So if you saw my talk at SCR this past year, then this is the diagram that I adapted from that talk that's based on stuff that I published last year with Whitney, and then based on a paper that Miguel wrote in 2016 that talks about like problems that people introduce in your studies. was highly relevant, and then also that Whitney was highly relevant from 2014. So let's say we're looking at racial disparities. So this could apply to any early life exposure. And I define race to be an early life exposure because that's when you define your race. And then I see you 30 years later in my study, right? So let's say I want to do a study looking at racial disparities in real life depression, which is basically whether or not your HIV virus is suppressed in general, or maybe like when you're taking antiretroviral therapy. So inherently in that study, you're restricting the people who are HIV positive, who are alive at the time of the study, and are willing to participate in the study. And there's a lot of data to show that there are racial disparities in HIV incidence and whether or not you live, and whether or not you participate in the study. So there's an arrow from race to that. And there's sort of all sorts of common causes between this node and the real life depression. And so there's inherently this selection bias here that happens because your exposure occurs prior to the start of the study. And I'll make a further point on that, right? So I'm hanging out with my race for 30 years before I saw you, and that influences whether or not I'm in your study. And so this builds on Tyler and Whitney's work talking about selected populations. In the 2014 paper in the appendix, which is buried in there, most people probably haven't even read, and they're like, oh, we wrote this fabulous paper. Oh, but wait, if you study selected populations, you have a problem. And so they use like pregnancy, like pregnant women as an example, but you can come up with many examples. And I think every population is frankly a selected population, right? Whether it's pregnant women, HIV positive people who are alive, people who cross the street. I mean, every population. So you could get pretty extreme with it. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Before I do, I just wanted to make a distinction between selection and confounding bias. So I remember I was asked to give a talk in a short course on causal infants and obesity like 5 years ago. Was never asked back again, probably because of what I had to say in this session. But, you know, once you get up in front of some of these brilliant people in the field, statisticians, et cetera, get up and they say, you know, we got to think about confounding, you know, observational studies, but if you can randomize, it was even nothing. We would get no bias. We'd have been good to go because, you know, it's the gold standard, it's the truth. It's like, it's not the truth. What are you guys talking about? So I get up there and I say, look, RCTs are subject to bias just like observational studies. Maybe different kinds of bias, so maybe you don't have to really worry as much about confounding. The selection is the problem. Measurement error is a problem. Let's not act like, you know, RCTs solve every problem there is, because there isn't, right? And so I have this slide in here to distinguish between selection and confounding and when, you know, they're a problem when they're not. So randomization in an RCT protects against confounding, but not against selection bias. It just doesn't, period, right? You need to still be thinking about who's in your sample. So the reason why this happens is because, so let's say you randomize, so your exposures are, you know, determined. You did a good job at the randomization, right? But in terms of who samples, you know, maybe people with covariate L, higher values of covariate L are more likely to be in the study and also more likely to have the outcome, right? So you have this diagram. So for this diagram, you don't have any confounding bias, but you can still potentially, well, have selection bias, obviously of the absolute measure. If you're just getting the prevalence of the outcome, that's going to be biased if you don't do anything, right? The relative effect is going to be good to go because there's no relationship between the exposure and the outcome, so there's no potential for an interaction, right? But once that error happens, and let's say you have an interaction, then there's the potential for the relative effect measure to be biased. So this diagram can be present. But this diagram can never apply in an RCT setting. Because in an RCT setting, you sample people to be in the RCT, then you randomize them. So in this diagram, the exposure precedes who gets into the sample, which isn't going to be the case. Like you just grabbing people, and then you assign the exposure. So this type of diagram you will never have in an RCT, right? And you will never have this diagram either in an RCT. So it's more limited in terms of the types of biases that you can have, even though you can still have bias. Same thing with dropout, sort of. So we have this diagram again, where now you have some sample and some people start to drop out of your study, right? And so you're going to have absolute bias, but no relative. For this one, you could have relative and absolute. And you could have this diagram, which contrasts the in-selection bias issue, right? Because now dropout happens after the exposure is defined. So this diagram can actually happen in the setting of a randomized study, as well as this diagram. And so that's why I think it's really helpful to distinguish between in-selection and out-selection, even though I feel like in that 2004 paper that McGill wrote, he just had one note and said it was dropout and called it C, even though sometimes he was talking about in and out. And I just found it to be confusing because it's very different. The estimation process is drastically different for in versus out selection, period. And I'll make that point. But now I make it different. I see C is for censoring for out, and S is for in. And I have found that to be actually really helpful. And then he's also introduced other stuff like N for, you know, observation plan, things like that. But this is, you know, a simple, I guess, dichotomy for me. And then I want to make this point. So this is another place where that 2004 paper, there was stuff there in the hall that McGill moved out for like 20 years, didn't tell me. And then I like had to, you know, he came down and gave a talk when I was at UNC in my postdoc for the causal inference research that they have, and I was the organizer. And so I had been working on that 2016 paper, or maybe a lab prior to the 2016 paper. And I was like, these simulations doesn't make any sense. Why am I like getting these biases in settings that I don't think so? Like Steve didn't know what was going on. I was like, this is a mess. So I was like, Miguel, what's going on? Like, so, and he broke it down, and I was like, what? And so then I, you know, wrote a paper on it. So I was like, thank you, Miguel, for handing me this paper. So in the context of confounding bias, we have confounding happens because there's a lack of exchangeability between the exposure and output. So you guys all know that. Exchangeability also applies for selection. And again, at the time, nobody knew that, and that was one of my dissertation papers. And I was like, okay, I'm going to talk about exchangeability for selection, like we talked about. And so basically, you end up with a lack of exchangeability between the people who are sampled and not sampled. They're not exchangeable in terms of variables that relate to the outcome. Same thing whether they're censored or not censored, or in some stratum or not in the stratum, right? And so this lack of exchangeability between who were censored and not censored then transfers can cause a lack of exchangeability between who's exposed and not exposed. So when it causes a lack of exchangeability between who's exposed and not exposed, then you end up with that relative selection bias. When it doesn't, then you end up with just the absolute, essentially. So it's a point that I wanted to make. And then this point is that, and I think Miguel has now written more about this, but at the time when I was thinking about this, he hadn't. And so part of the reason why, and I kind of mentioned this in the 2016 paper, part of the reason why you end up with selection bias in, you know, that diagram 2 or whatever that looks like this in that 2016 paper is that you're essentially estimating a joint effect where the two exposures of interest when you're estimating a joint effect in relation to the outcome is the main exposure, and then the censoring node is the joint effect. Because you're thinking about trying to intervene on dropout or the censoring mechanism. Like what would have happened if you could have intervened and sampled everybody? What would have been your estimate? Or what would have happened if you had intervened and been able to preclude dropout? And so there's an intervention on this selection node that no one really made clear to me, and it was the source of the bias in this setting. And so it was literally like, I was like, I've been struggling for months on this, Miguel. He answered in like 2 seconds. I was like, what? Like, where is this written? And he's like, it's not anywhere. And so when you are trying to estimate a relative effect in the context of selection or censoring, the causal conscious of interest. So a little bit of notation here. So you're comparing the mean potential outcome had everyone, let's say, been exposed and not been censored, to the mean potential outcome had everyone not been exposed and, again, not been censored. Similarly, it applies for selection, right? And so, essentially, you're doing a joint intervention whether you know it or not. If you could expose everyone, what would have happened versus not? And if you could have set everyone to not have been censored or for everyone to have been sampled. And because you're estimating a joint intervention, the effect of a joint intervention, you have to think about sources of bias not only for the exposure in relation to the outcome, but for the censoring in relation to the outcome. So it's sort of like you have confounding of the censoring outcome relationship, right? We're not really calling it confounding, we're calling it selection bias, right? Because it has to bias arising from selection, right? Because even if you had these two, which I guess you couldn't really have them, but if you didn't have any selection, they wouldn't be a problem. So it's sort of like you have to think about two sets of confounders, right? Sort of the same way when you're assessing interaction in that paper that Tyler published. You have two sets of confounders you need to be thinking about. So it's the same idea. So it was sort of like, oh my gosh, like my whole life has changed because I didn't realize this. And so basically, what this means is that when you're doing causal inference, trying to estimate the effect of exposure and outcome, and you have censoring or selection, you are estimating a joint effect, right? And the bar is a little higher there, right? Whether or not you knew it, you've been doing it for 20 years, you didn't know about it. And so that basically means that there can't be any unmeasured common causes of the exposure to the outcome. And there can't be unmeasured common causes of selection in the outcome, or you might get the wrong answer, right? And so now it's all over that, you know, Miguel and Jamie's book chapters now. But it was nowhere for a long time when I was trying to reason a lot of this stuff on explain biases and I didn't understand what was going on. Other things that have to apply here, which I may talk about in one of my big papers that was published in like 2011, was that, well, I didn't talk about consistency because I wasn't very good at it. Talked about positivity and this sustainability issue, which goes back to the joint effect. And then we also have this consistency problem, right, where you need to be able to conceive of a realistic intervention that you could actually do, and it's well defined, because then you get the outcome that you expect, that you would have. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in part 2. And I'm also going to talk about how you could use the diagram and everything that I've taught you up to this point or covered to minimize the selection bias using standard adjustment as well as inverse probability weighting procedures and other approaches, but this is the main approach that I'm going to focus on because I think it's the easiest to understand at this point. And then the last point, which I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on, but basically you can have selection without bias, right? Just because you select a group of people to be in your study doesn't mean that it's going to end up with bias. And that point is made earlier where in some setting the absolute measure is biased, but the relative measure is not, etc. So there's just some examples that I've taken from the Hernan and Robbins textbook that I'm not going to go over in the interest of time. But if you read those, chapter 8, then you're good to go, essentially. So just to summarize part 1, causal diagrams can be used to distinguish between absolute and versus relative and an out-selection bias, so a lot of different jargon there. And when in the context of censoring or sampling, the causal contrast that you're interested in is trying to estimate its joint effect, where the two effects are the exposure and the censoring. And then in certain settings, conditioning on a common effect doesn't result in selection bias, which goes back to the point of you can have selection, but in certain situations it won't introduce bias. So let's take a 10-minute break before part 2. So people can go to the bathroom, have some water, and then somehow we're miraculously sort of on time. So, and we'll go with the second part.
Questions for you?
Sure.
My name is Lila, by the way. I'm
Hi,
really
nice to meet you.
enjoying your lecture. It's blowing my mind. Just about in this and I'm trying to follow along, going back to remembering your nomenclature, but isn't this just an as treated?
Oh, I'm good, thank you. Yeah.
Isn't essentially what you're proposing an as treated analysis? Like I'm trying to think about like how would I operationalize this in a study?
So it's not as treated because, or as how I conceive it, because you are able to intervene and force everybody to do what you want to do. The as treated corresponds more to an RCT where you assign something and people don't really adhere. And then the as treated is that you actually factor in what they actually did in your analysis versus what you assign them to do.
Okay.
Here you just assume that the assignment works, everybody does, like you have the ability to force people to do whatever.
Oh, okay. Well, do we have the ability?
Well, in this made-up world of counterfactuals,
Okay.
right? Like,
Yeah.
essentially, it's just a made-up world, like a hypothetical world, thinking about hypothetical interventions.
Mm-hmm.
That,
Oh, it might be really quick.
yeah. Yeah, thinking about hypothetical interventions that allow you to, figure out, like, in an ideal setting, this is how you get the answer, but then you start thinking about, okay, well, let's be more realistic. What can we do to, like, clean this up to deal with the reality that we're actually living in?
Question. I'm trying to get back to the slide. So we're trying to publish a paper where we used van der Waals method for calculating indirect and direct effects. We've already gotten a lot of feedback about it from like internal reviewers. Yeah. And I'm just like still kind of mind blown about this confounder. Yeah. And like in a real world setting, how would we test this?
What do you mean, how would you test it?
So I'm thinking about like the paper we're working on, and our outcome is viral load, and our exposure is food security. We made it binary, and of course viral load is continuous. And our mediator, we tested a bunch of them. One of them was like diet quality. Yeah. So we know food security leads to diet quality. Your food security status leads to your diet quality. Your diet quality leads to your viral load and your viral suppression. What's a mediator that would be or a compounder that would be associated with our mediator and outcome, but not our exposure? Like in the model, how would I assess that, and how would I?
I mean, so you don't assess it in the model in the sense like you base it on your theory and you draw a diagram, and then you do whatever analysis. So you look at the literature and say, are there things that predict the mediator, and are there things that predict the outcome, regardless of whether or not they're influenced by the exposure. That could totally happen too. But and then if you have those measured, then you can take them into account. So if this is what your diagram looks like, then you can simply just adjust for the confounding and be done.
But in the model where it adds a mediator, or prior to adding the mediator?
In the model with the mediator.
Okay.
But if you're in a world where the exposure causes the confounder of the mediator-outcome relationship, then you can't use standard regression. You have to use some kind of true method like IPW or parametric formula.
Exposure causes the confounder.
Okay. Right, because if you control for this, then basically you're moving part of the indirect effect that you want to estimate, or the direct effect that you want to estimate. It's operating through the confounder. Okay. So Tyler talks about that in the marginal structural models for estimating direct and indirect effects paper. There's a section where he says if you are in a world where you have mediator outcome confounding that are affected by exposure, then you cannot use standard adjustment. You need to use G methods. But he doesn't ever explicitly state why. Yeah. And after like racking my head for like 5 years, I was like, oh, it's because if you just control for something that's influenced by the exposure, right, then you are removing part of the direct effect that you want to estimate and potentially introducing selection bias. Right. So, and it stems from thinking about the marginal structural model literature, thinking about time-varying confounding affected by a prior exposure. This confounder isn't time-varying, but it's affected by prior exposure.
In this, example. Okay, because in our paper, it's a longitudinal cohort study and everything. It's time-varying.
Yeah, so it's even worse there. And so they have a paper to how to do mediation analyses where you have time-varying mediators, exposures, and outcomes, which takes everything to a whole other level. So, but it's based on, so you can use standardization to deal with that problem, but standardization is basically just a non-parametric version of the G formula, where the G formula is the fully parametric version.
Okay, I'm going to look for that paper.
And you can also do it through IPW, so you basically remove the error here and here using your first probability weights.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm going to think about it some more. Thank you.
Okay. Hi.
This is us.
Okay, yeah. So this example is the one that Daniel Webster talks about in that the fallacy of the 2x2 table paper with Sandra Greenland. And I think, again, this looks a little bit like Bergson's bias. But yeah, I almost never think about this example in the context of cohort studies because usually it more looks like the diagram that I have where it's people are censored for non-death reasons. The censor lost a follow-up, they drop out, and then you know, they are alive and doing their thing, but they, you don't know what their outcome is, right? And so, but this can happen too. It just doesn't happen as often, in my opinion, in the cohort study setting. But you're completely right. Like, but if you're in a set, at least U.S. cohorts, like if you're in a setting somewhere else where you can't even, you're not even assessing death, like universally, then it's a problem.
Anything that you're, so even if it's not death, though, it's just,
it's anything that you're not,
liver failure, anything that's going to make you tend to not show up and not be found by the researchers, and for which you don't have some external way to
so it's not only the thing that causes you to be censored, but it causes your outcome to not be like observed. Because you can drop out of the study and they can get it for you in some settings. So yes, I agree. I agree with that. Yeah. But yeah, that you should take a look, if you haven't, at that Western paper where he's doing that. Because I looked at that paper when I was writing my 2016 paper, because he goes to a bunch of different diagrams, and I was like, is this similar to mine? Because I'm not sure. Because I was trying to explain where the source of that bias is coming from. And this is another one of the settings where you just look at the diagram and you're like, you don't have a collider. What's going on?
Well, you know, we locally we fake this with there must be other causes of Y.
Yeah.
And so indeed, we can, indeed, we're just conditioning on a descendant of a collider. Have you heard this workaround?
Yeah. Well, I haven't heard the workaround, but I know the conditioning on a descendant of a collider business.
So that's our, but I don't love that explanation. I mean, I think I would put this more in the camp of what you are talking about.
Okay.
Selection bias
Oh,
without colliders.
Yes. Yeah. I definitely see that. I agree with that.
So maybe it's figure 2B. Perhaps.
Yeah. In that paper, I agree.
I mean, it's anything where outcome will affect you being tallied or measured by the investigators, and I think that's common enough.
Yeah. It's just confusing because it's the outcome itself that is creating the problem.
It is.
Versus some other thing. So it makes it first like hard to wrap your mind around, and then you're like, okay, let's work through this. But yeah, this is definitely.
We wrote about this led by Maya in about 5 or 7 years ago in AJE. Maybe you saw this.
By who? Who was this?
Maya
Peterson?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So some real methodologists helped us with this.
Yeah. No, I mean, I looked at some of her work in this regard, but the paper that's like most in my mind is that Westrick paper that builds on some earlier paper. I think because that was another thing where Pearl and I think Sander and maybe Jamie had written about it, but like buried in some literature that nobody really thinks about or has seen. And, you know, people think about it usually in the case control setting, probably with the arrow from A to C, and it looks like a collider. And there was some paper, Rhian Daniels wrote a paper too, saying we can't really explain it, but we see it in simulation. And I think she like modified the diagram in that paper too a little bit to say there's underlying things that involve a collider that you don't see.
Maybe
so
that's
it's that
the
same feeling.
thing,
Yeah, it's the same idea.
Have you heard this called the unipath collider, or unipath selection bias?
No, who coined that term?
You know the father and son Shahar team from Arizona.
Oh, I don't know that.
Oh, okay. They've actually written.
The name sounds familiar. I'm not. Maybe I've looked at their papers, but I can't remember.
It's this real iconoclast.
Okay.
Shahar.
Okay.
He's actually written a lot in selection bias. Mostly it's self-published.
Oh, okay.
But not all. You might find it. I can't be sure what's right or wrong in it, but you could figure it out, I'm sure.
Okay, I'll take a look. I'll take a look.
You've got a lot of other selection biases that don't involve classic collider stratification.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take a look. Okay, cool. I'm gonna go to the bathroom real quick.
Sure, it's out here somewhere. We live at our home building, so we don't know where it is either.
Oh, okay.
It's sort of like people about
Oh my God. So Jess, to warn me that swimming may involve great bodily harm to my child.
Oh, well, gosh,
She
what
nearly
happened?
broke her nose swimming face first on the side of the swimming pool wall.
Yeah, those damn walls.
Is that
The wall and the bottom are the major hazards in the pool. Well, it's better, probably better than the usual mechanism of right here on the backstroke.
Oh, okay.
Which can
Well, thank you
result
for
in a real head trauma.
right,
Ouch.
right. Well, so I'm glad.
She bleed off the
Thank you.
wall?
Yeah.
It looks a lot worse than it is.
Yes, that ended up being the case.
It can be alarming to all parties.
And has your daughter sustained any other injuries that anxious parents of future swimmers should be aware of?
No, that is how did it,
I have no idea.
well,
Tried to reconstruct a series of events. Unsuccessful.
ouch.
Anyway.
How, what does the scar look like?
Oh, it's just a series. I mean, it's she just looks like a box.
Did she crack anything?
No, thank goodness. Family injuries? Just like ongoing, yeah, right. In addition to the concussion, Corma swam into the side of the wall last week. Nearly broke her nose, but no, there were no cracks.
Yeah, that's,
But Jeff's daughter is still inside.
Oh, I see.
she won't do it again, I can guarantee you.
Right,
This is terrific. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks. It's been a good audience.
Yeah,
Very
yeah.
interactive.
They're very passionate about that.
Yeah, probably more than I am. I'm like, oh, it doesn't matter. But, I mean, some examples, it doesn't matter. So I'm so pessimistic now about it. It's like a bummer.
I think I own a lot of collider bias examples. It's hard to do collider bias.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's actually, I was telling Tomas, like one of the things I think is that there's not very much empirical evidence on selection processing for us to actually guide our
Yeah.
simulations, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
beta, like that's what was the hardest thing about Elizabeth Rose's simulation. Like what's reasonable?
What's reasonable? Yeah, I
You don't
remember
know.
reading the paradox, like, this is very helpful, this is fantastic, but thinking, I mean, you know, you guys knew the area a lot better. I mean, maybe in the context of mortality outcomes, it matters a lot more. I don't know. Or like aging outcomes or something. It matters more than in some of the areas that I've worked in, because it's been rough going, and it's been an issue where people have called me out and said, no, your results, it doesn't matter. And I'm like, you know, like during my talks, it makes me feel bad.
That's always nice.
Right? They're like, this doesn't matter. It's fine. All right, I will get started.
That setting that she has with the DAG. We considered it internal validity. So when you say internal validity, are we getting the right control back for the target population, not for the population?
Never even done, I don't even have a name for the population yet. Yeah, I would
So
consider.
you do not distinguish between internal and external.
No, I do.
Then what's external?
External validity is not the population, is not the direct population that you sampled from. If you sampled from San Francisco, external validity then means, what does my answer mean for New York?
So population.
Am I completely wrong here?
I actually think the term we're using is
Oh, yeah.
And
Oh, that we know.
I think it doesn't, I mean, it doesn't really matter what the label is, we just have to be clear about it. Different, like,
Daniel's
people in
calling
your
it
analysis.
target validity.
Oh yeah, Daniel,
Daniel will not
Daniel's
distinguish,
working on a
right?
book right now, and he sent me the selection, or some chapter to read. And I was like, Daniel, you know I disagree with half of you. He's like, you have your view. And I said, I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong, but you need to define it in like a more explicit way, and not just say selection bias and see this like universally defined for everyone. Because I'm more traditional. in how I view it, because the way, I think when you make selection bias external validity issues, the way that they're hearing it, the selection bias no longer exists. Like, to me, because they're saying, oh, we did some RCTs, and now, you know, depending upon the population, you know, then we re-weighted to get to some other population having nothing to do with the selection bias. And I was like, the way you define it, I've been calling that selection bias for forever, and a lot of people still call that selection bias. And so if you want to change the definition, you just need to be very explicit about it.
Okay, so there are three things. Did you get the right causal effect? This is about the relative effort.
Yeah.
Did you get the right causal effect for the people in your sample? Did you get the right causal effect for the people that your sample was supposedly drawn from? And did you get the right could you get the right causal effect for some totally other population? Those are the three things. And you put both of the first two as intermediate.
Yeah, and the last one, how I justify, oh, it's just an example of time system in New York. To me, that's about effect modification. And the distribution being different in the two populations, and that's why I see a different answer. It's not about bias, it's about effect modification.
I think
Let's recruit her. We think alike.
I think Daniel is called, maybe I'm wrong about this, but the first internal validity, the second external validity, and the third transportability.
Well, he's calling them all actually, he's calling them target validity now. And
Well, yeah,
you get
he
rid of
doesn't
the-
want to distinguish, that's true.
And he's right. Let's be absolutely explicit what we are comparing it to and not forget the labels. The whole thing is called target validity. It's kind of a
I
good point.
disagree with him about that. I
Right?
think it is a good point, but I disagree. I had to think about it a lot.
All right,
I
so
even said in my
we're going to get back to
it.
So we're going to get started again, now that we've had that lovely 10-minute break, and we're going to focus on the second half, which is more on the estimation of, you know, all of the theoretical things that I talked about. So specifically, we're going to talk about tools for minimizing absolute and relative in-selection bias. And when I first started thinking about tools, like many years ago, I always used to say, like, address or eliminate or resolve. But that's actually not a good way to view it, because to me, every study has some bias in it, in my opinion, and so I like to use the term minimize when I do it on purpose, because there's no perfect study, right? So I just wanted to highlight that point. So there are two main approaches that I've highlighted before for minimizing absolute and relative selection bias. There's the design approach and the analytic approach, and I feel like in terms of the literature, I spend more time thinking about design now than I used to, and that a lot of people do. So there's a bunch of things here. You could perhaps label them if you like. They might be hard to know the distinction between some of this stuff. But in terms of the design, now I'm changing the language a little bit to match my paper. So I kind of use source and target population interchangeably, even though they're sort of different things. So the first part I talked about is source population. So now I'm focusing on a target. And target population is basically just who you want to draw inference to. And let's just pretend that the source and the target are the same. The source is who you physically go to sample to draw inference to the target, just to clarify. So if you wanted to minimize absolute and relative in-selection bias, one easy thing to do is to sample the entire target population. Then there's no selection. And without selection, you can't have any selection bias. So let's all do that, and then we're done. It's very easy, right? But, I mean, for financial reasons, time reasons, people refusing to participate in your study, you know, even if you had the money to get everybody, you can't necessarily. And a classic example is some of these like big surveys that the United States does, the census and other things, and we sample some parts of the whole U.S. population because it's unrealistic to get everybody. So another design approach is basically, okay, you can't take everybody or sample everyone, so who you sample, just make sure you ensure that it's a random sample of the target population. And so I didn't highlight this, but these slides focus on the in-selection part, so when you're putting the cohorts together versus the out where the cohorts together, the people are leaving. And so that's slightly different. And so when you're putting your samples together, make it as random as possible. So even if X is there and you're conditioning on X, you have no determinant of who gets in, because if it's a random sample, then there's no condition of who gets in versus who doesn't. So that would be great. Or, more realistically, you can try to make your sample as random as possible, and that minimizes arrows into X, meaning the number of arrows that go into X, or the number of or given the determinant, it makes it weaker, so that even if there are determinants of selection, the process for selection isn't that strong. So an example that you could do in terms of essentially trying to get as many examples as possible is perhaps, and I talk about that 2018 paper on health disparities, is to change the study design. That could actually be quite helpful in this context. So let's say you start out with a cross-sectional study and maybe there's a lot of bias there, and in the example in that paper, changing it inherently to a cohort study actually helps minimize the bias. And that's a simple thing to do in theory, but maybe you did a cross-sectional study for some reason and you can't change it. But if you can, I would encourage you to explore that avenue. Another thing we do in that 2018 public disparities paper is also talk about how you can minimize the bias by redefining the target population, right? And you do it in such ways to minimize the number of exclusions that happen, like the number of people who are selected out, or do it in such a way that it minimizes the number or the strength of the arrows that go into that. So the example in that 2018 paper was we were trying to estimate racial disparities in some outcome, I can't remember which outcome it was. And essentially, yeah, I think it might have been death or something, or something else. And so we said, okay, we want to look at these racial disparities in this birth cohort of people who were born in like 1940. And the study was in 2016. So a lot of people died, and death was a selection mechanism between when they were born, which is when their exposure rate was defined, and when they get to your study, let's say 80 years later, right? And so you could redefine your target population and say, I don't want to draw infants anymore to the people who were born in 1940. I actually want to draw infants to the people who were born in 1970, right? And so there's less time between when the exposure is defined and when you start to study, and inherently less people are going to die and less people are going to be excluded, right? And I think the exclusion was 20% of the initial population, so like, 80% of your initial population being excluded, only like 20% being included, because in this study you're getting 40-year-olds who are less likely to die than having died 80-year-olds, something like that. So that's a simple thing you can do, but then it changes and more so limits the types of questions that you can ask. Like you're asking perhaps a different question. Maybe you're asking a question that you don't always get a proper answer to, which people do all the time, which I actually don't like. But but then you have to justify why is the answer going to be different for the 1970 cohort versus the 1940 cohort. And maybe it won't, but maybe it will, because there's a lot of things going on in terms of race and its impact and discrimination for people who had to live 80 years versus who had to live 40 years. So, you've got to be able to justify. You can't just change it and be done. You have to be able to justify why this change is better and not worse. So does that make sense? So another approach, and this was something I had been thinking about, but then the reviewer said, oh, you should categorize it in this way. So another way, and I think Maria did this in a paper recently that someone sent to me that isn't out yet, but it was like, again, AJE under, showing the early version of the paper, but another example of redefining the target population. So you could say, so going back to the example where you want to draw inference about racial disparities and biological suppression among people who are HIV positive, allowing them to participate in the study, right? And so initially we had to add from race to no. But if you change your causal estimate, what your research question is, you can say, well, why don't I get results for persons who are HIV positive, allowing them to participate, regardless of their race? And that regardless matters, because basically saying regardless of what race you had, you would have been HIV positive, you would have been alive, and you would have participated. It should remove this arrow from race to no, and for this diagram there shouldn't be any relative in-selection bias, right? And so this is what's been called the survivor average causal effect. And you can get bounds or an estimate. Usually it's bounds, I think, because it applies physical stratification with a physical strata that you're interested in are the survivors, essentially. And so I kind of put it in the paper, didn't really think about it. I have learned about the survivor average causal effect and I always felt like this isn't very useful. I wrote another paper that underscored that. And then in the paper that I mentioned at Maria, you guys actually did something. So what did you actually do in your example for the survivor average causal effect?
Eric has suggested two ways of estimating
fact, the selection bias often is not that big because it's solving the collider bias selection problem, so
Yeah.
it's more of an argument for, and our discussion of it started with when I was trying to inverse probability weight against death.
Yeah.
And somebody accused us of weighting up for zombies or.
Yeah, I remember that paper. And there was kind of response to that. That was
That
good.
response was sort of brought in the survival average problem with us to argue. Actually, there's a totally coherent thing to be estimating here that you can get with IPW.
Okay.
And in the paper that I think that you're talking about in the regards cohort,
Yeah.
we estimated the crudest, simplest effect estimate. I think it was racial inequalities and two cardiovascular risk factors. We did the simplest, like, complete case analysis, and
Yeah.
then we did every fancy thing we could think of, and it did not matter at all.
Yeah, I think I remember that confusion. So again, where does it matter?
But
yeah.
NIH, like, the regards wanted it because they didn't think that was under about the cohort.
Yes, I mean, I think it's always easy to say, but what if? But then, provide some evidence to show it actually doesn't matter. But I'm not surprised. I mean, based on my stuff, but maybe, you had death data, it would have been very different. So, yeah, essentially, my issue with this is that, yeah, you get this estimate for a population that exists, but you don't know who this population is. Like, who are these people who would survive regardless of their race? And if you're thinking about doing intervention, how do you go out and target those people? You can't, because you come up with an estimate for a population that you can't easily identify, right? And this has been the big pushback, because this is related to instrument and variable approaches, essentially, and that's been the big issue for IB. It's like, well, who are these compliers? Who are they? Can I find you on the street, And that's why you get an estimate for a population that you may not be able to readily, implement any interventions in, knowingly. So that's why I'm not so pumped about this, even though I think it's cool to think about in practice, what does it actually mean in terms of public health impact? I haven't been convinced to this point, but I still had it in the paper, because theoretically, it is possible that this could be helpful. And perhaps this is the empty set, like, maybe nobody in the population actually is like this, but you don't even know. So it's kind of, it's a little bit unsatisfying, at least for me. So I just have this here again, because this is made a point that I make in this paper with Whitney. So you can read further, and then when Maria's papers come out, you can look at that as well, because that actually has an application that she uses. I actually just talk about it and don't actually estimate anything. Okay, so then now we talked about the design. Now we're going to talk about the analysis. So a lot of this you've probably seen before in that 2004 paper, and I spent a lot of time. That 2004 paper glossed over a lot analytically, and it's mostly theory and not practice. And I'm all about the implementation. And so, that 2016 paper that I wrote focused a lot on the implementation, and that's what I'm going to try to focus here, not only in terms of writing the SAS code, but what's actually going on underneath the hood, which I think a lot of times people don't know. They just enter some stuff, variables in, push a button, and get results, and hope and pray that nothing went wrong. And I think you can sort of assess better if something did go wrong if you know what's actually going on under the hood. So again, this is another part where you might not see this anywhere else, and it stems from my dissertation work on informative censoring, a lot of it, where I focus on this algorithm that no one uses, and I tried to bring back, but it didn't really work, called the redistribute to the right algorithm. And I spent years creating diagrams that look just like some of the stuff that you're going to see here, and it's directly related to the probability weighting. And trying to come with IPW is easier to explain, but still using the representation typically. So the two most common approaches that people use to deal with selection bias is adjustment and stratification, even if they don't know this, and then also inverse probability weighting. So in the context of in-selection, you can actually only use inverse probability weighting if the source population or target population is defined. If you don't know that population and can't measure it, then you can't use IPW here, because you need to have some data on those people who aren't sampled in. But going into toy example, for these simple examples, I'll go over it, but in practice, oftentimes you can't do it. So this is the simple example I'm going to use involving collider stratification bias, and for this diagram. So if this is what your diagram looks like, and you have in-selection bias, how do you deal with it via adjustment stratification? It's just basically you just got a condition on L, and then this non-causal pathway is closed. Pretty simple, McDonald's step 2004, right? Very, very easy to do. And so maybe we haven't been doing as bad of a job as we thought, because a lot of these L's could also potentially be confounders if L also caused A, and so you may have control for it anyway, and so you didn't do as much harm, essentially. But another approach that Miguel talks about, well, actually involves inverse probability weighting, right? And so what this does is essentially you can remove all measured errors into S via ICW, and basically end up with unbiased absolute and relative methods. And so you can inverse probability weight to basically move the arrow from L to S, and you're good to go, essentially. And pretty straightforward. So I'm going to walk you through some examples. So again, let's work in a simplified example where let's assume that A and L are binary in time state, meaning they don't change over time or they're not moving over time. So you can actually estimate an inverse probability weight. So this is the inverse probability of being collected into your sample. And so this is just the equation that shows it. And so the example in the Hernan and Robbins Quadrant textbook is similar to this, except they use C instead of S, but I like to distinguish. So basically you estimate for everyone who sampled 1 over the probability of being sampled position on L and A to build a determinant of collection in the diagram. And then I reproduce it in terms of an exit function, which comes out of a logistic regression model, basically, where you use the parameters of a logistic regression model to get probabilities, essentially. And so these parameters, alpha 1, when you take the analog, is basically the sampling odds ratio, comparing L equals 1 to L equals 0 in terms of who gets in, and alpha 2 is the sampling odds ratio for alpha 1, comparing alpha 1 to alpha 0. So it's pretty straightforward. And anyone who's not sampled gets a weight of 0 because who's sampled basically is reweighted to reflect the people who didn't get sampled, so they don't need to be counted again if you weren't sampled. So essentially, these weights are called WI, I indexing the person, or type person. So WI is the number of participants who are like individual I in terms of their values for L and A that would have been selected into the cohort had everyone been sampled. Because the idea is that you wanted everybody to study, not just who got into study, right? You just didn't have the money to sample everyone, right? And so, but you want people who are like, you want people in your study who are like the people who didn't get in terms of things that are related to your predicted outcome, like L and A, essentially, right? So the example I like to use is if I'm doing a study and sampling, let's say from this room, and we're trying to estimate some quantity, right? And let's say like race and gender are the things that predict the outcome. And let's say I'm the only black woman in this room and I do these. Who's here to represent my outcome? No one, right? But there might be, if there are other black women in this room, then they could represent me, right? Because they're like me in the ways that matter to the outcome, right? So it's that idea where someone in this who's black in this room is reweighted to reflect themselves plus me after I left. So does that make sense? So a simple calculation that you could do is, let's say you have 5 individuals with some source as part of your population, and you only are able to sample 250. And in this first population of the 500, 100 of those individuals have a value of 1 for L and 0 for A. And then of these 100, 25 actually get into your study. So if we were just to do a simple calculation based on the formulas I have, and we're trying to reweight the people who are sampled to reflect themselves with the people who weren't sampled, right? We would say 1 over the probability of being sampled condition on your value for L equals 0. So based on this information, one of the 4 people who have L equals 1 and A equals 0 in the source population actually get into the study. So that basically means 1 out of every 4 of the people who have L equals 1 and A equals 0. So you reweight it. So now in the reweighted population, there are 4 people, right? The one person who got in plus the 3 people who didn't get in, right? So you're reweighting it just to reflect the people who didn't get it. It's really simple, right? It's a really simple idea that got crazy very quickly. anybody, you can only do this if you have some information both on the sample and the source. So you have to have L and A measures both in the sample and in the source, even though you weren't able to get everybody to see your study. If you don't have that information, you don't know what people's values were in the source population, then there's no way to do this, because you don't know who the people who are like the people that sample should be included in the denominator. This is why it's a little bit more. And actually, in this situation, I will probably advocate for, unless there's an extenuating circumstance, just to deal with stratification, use stratification or adjustment to deal with this, because you actually don't have to have data on the individual sample to get the right answer. You can go for minimize the selection bias in this setting. Does that make sense? All right. So then. So, to preserve the amount of information in the observed data, so some people freak out about inverse probability weighting, because now you have a sample with 4, times people you should have had. And they're like, you just make it up data, like what's wrong with you? Like, don't do that. And so, people can often stabilize and get stabilized weights, so that you actually keep the original sample size without like seeming like you're making up data, but the results should be the same. But it can make you feel better. So you can stabilize the weight. So instead of it just being 1 over the probability of being sample conditional on L and A, you can put it in the numerator, just the marginal probability of being sample, not conditional on anything. And so unlike the unweighted pseudo population that you generate, where it gives you a population has everyone been sampled, this gives you a population has sampling been random. Right? So you have some selection, but it's not biased because it's random with respect to A and L, which are the things that we're determining sampling, essentially, right? So based on this example, then you now need to calculate the probability of marginal, right? Probability of being sampled. And so that's simple because 250 of the 500 were sampled, so it's 1/2. And you put the 1/2 over the 1/4, and you end up with 2 people instead of 4. So it sort of like retracts the number of people that you have in the population. Right now it's at distribution and gets you closer back to what you would have observed in your population if you had selection but there was no bias. So the example, I remember, there's not a lot of examples where people actually do this in the real world. And I remember this comes out of a lecture I used to give in postdoc. And I said, see, one example, he's like, this paper is more accurate. I was like, okay, so we'll just like include this screenshot so people can, I eventually did read that as a paper. And it's a complicated paper, but this is essentially what they're doing is different weighting strategies to control for selection bias. So I would encourage you to take a look at this paper for a real world application and not just like this for example. But I'm not going to spend that much more time on this because I want to spend more time on the selection bias that happens going out because it's a little bit more complicated in terms of the approaches that you do. So as I said, let's talk about some of these tools for minimizing absolute and relative out selection bias. So again, and other people chime in, because this slide is not comprehensive in any way, but design, minimize dropout, let's say, from your study. That's an example. That's pretty straightforward. You do extreme no dropout, right? But dropout is possible. I guess another approach that kind of Jeff mentioned is like of the people who are lost, you go try to track down some of them, but then that introduces potential other biases. Who is found isn't usually a random sample of who is lost.
You look for a random sample.
Hmm?
You look for a random sample of who was lost, and you spend a lot of money finding it.
Yes, but I doubt that you actually, who you get back is random.
If you get a high, if you get a high percentage of who you look for, you might begin to be persuaded. That's the only thing you can do.
Yeah, but there are approaches to deal with the fact that it's probably not a random sample in terms of who was lost. And so that's work I think that Meyer's done and some other people have done. Konstantin Frangakis has done some of that work. And I'm trying to implement that in one of my grants eventually. But it still complicates the problem because now you got to find some more people, and who you find is selective, so then you got to fix the fact that now you got 2 selective processes. So it could easily become a nightmare. So if you can really have an outcome where it's easy to find people, like not in death situations, but usually death in the U.S., we've got that, down. We can find those people even if, like, we don't, they left and we don't talk to anybody. We can go to something like death registry and have that stuff captured. For other things, it's much harder. Like HIV is hard for many reasons. Like the city did some cohort we filed with HIV incident. There could be various reasons why you don't know whether someone eventually will convert. So it can be really hard to implement and minimize the dropout bias. So we turn more heavily to the analysis approaches for out selection than we do to in selection. So again, still focusing on adjustment stratification and ICW. So for this diagram, again, we can use adjustment to just control for L and we're good to go in terms of the absolute and the relative selection bias. But for the inverse probability weighting, we need to end up having to remove arrows into dropout. So remove arrows from covariate to C and A to C through weighting. So here comes these diagrams that you need a microscope or something to look at. My apologies, but I like to have them all on one slide. But they are legible. You just have to lean in. So let's say that, now this is an example of how you apply it. So let's say, and this is based on the appendix of that 2016 paper that is like a beast. And I remember one of my co-authors, someone decided to email me when we were working on that paper. And she started reading it, and she's like, I'm not confident. I can't read like this 60 pages of these appendix, because it's just crazy. So it was just kind of funny at the time. So if you haven't read the appendix, like most people, you never sign the paper, that's fine. I go over most of it here, but a lot of it is in the appendix. The different scenarios, and it was kind of like a whole separate page in and of itself to write. But if there's something that you're confused about, definitely look, it's in the appendix. Everything here is in that appendix. And a lot of this stuff came out of my dissertation stuff. So let's say you have a population of 6 people. And you go to your IDs, S1 through S6. And then I like to use counting process notation and survival analysis, where we have an enter and exit for everyone, even if everyone exits at the same time, that's 0. And it becomes helpful for various reasons that I might consider, I can't remember. But then we have an indicator for dropout, whether or not someone dropped out when they exited. So 0 means that they didn't drop out when they exited. And 1 means that they did. And then A is the exposure, and L is some covariance. And so I wanted to keep this example simple because by hand it could get crazy. So I created a situation where you only have 2 types of people. Either you have a 1-1 for A and L or a 0-0, but there's really 4 types of people that could exist for this example. And then this is like a little nice diagram that shows these people followed from when they enter to when they exit. So a closed circle, a period means that they had the event of interest. An open right arrow means that they dropped out. And a closed right-headed arrow means that they reached the date of administrative censoring. So meaning that they were followed and they were censored, but not because they left on their own, it's because you reached the date of the analysis or you reached the date of the end of the study. So these 2 mechanisms for censoring are actually different because this is highly unlikely to be any kind of informative or selective because it was just an investigative decision about when follow-up ended. This has the potential to be informative because it was the participant's decision about when they left. So that's why I distinguish these 2 mechanisms. So given this population, you can estimate inverse probability of censoring weights. So how you do that again, A and L are binary, we have those 2 scenarios, and then time space, and we can use a linear regression model to estimate the probability of not dropping out. So at this point, this looks very different than the selection one, because I have this now, the weights are indexed by T. With selection, it wasn't indexed by T. You had only one weight for everybody, and that was it. Here, you have multiple weights over time, right? Because you have dropout occurring multiple times over time potentially. So here is basically 1 over the probability of not dropping out, condition on your values for L and A, and that you were in the risk set because you didn't have the event at that point. And then you have to multiply over time, which I'm going to go into detail. And so prior to dropout, you have a weight of PT. At the point when you drop out, you don't have a weight. represents you, so you don't need to be related. And so because this is a full logistic regression model, the estimate that you get is specifically a hazard odds ratio. And it's a hazard odds ratio for not dropping out as a function of L, which is represented by alpha 1, as well as the function of A, which is represented by alpha T. So essentially, it's the same idea where WIT is the number of participants who are like individual I in terms of their values for L and A that would have been in the risk set at time T in the absence of dropout, right? So if no one had dropped out, these people would still be in the risk set. But because dropout happened, the sample size is lower, and now who's left needs to be reweighted to reflect who would have been there if dropout didn't happen, essentially. So now we're going to try to do this by hand. And no one, I'm probably the only person in the world besides Steve Cole who does this by hand. But I think it's important to get a flavor of what the weights actually mean to do it by hand, because it looks very different than this selection scenario. So essentially, how you would estimate these weights is that you stratify the data by LNA. And you estimate the weights within strata LNA. And that's what like the logistic regression model is actually doing. So you include the graph again, but only showing the data for the people who have A equals 1 and L equals 1. And this is all the data you need to estimate how many people will be in the risk set for the people who have A equals 1, L equals 1. So it took me years to figure out how to present some of this stuff. Still not perfect, but it's good enough to get the job done. So if it's a little bit confusing, my apologies, but this is the best I can think about how to represent it simply in one diagram. So we then have that initial table, we have IDs, we have enter and exit, we have the dropout indicator, and we have A and L, and then we have this cumulative probability of not being censored, right? And then we take the inverse to get the weight. So essentially, for person S1, like in theory, with K, it can be an infinite, K was continuous. It could be like an infinite number of times you'd be assessed the weight, and you don't need to do that. You only really need to update the weight calculation when a dropout happens, because it's not going to change otherwise. So between 0 and 3, no one drops out. And so the inverse probability, or the probability of not dropping out between 0 and 3 is 3 over 3. If 3 over 3 people in the risk set didn't drop out. And it stays the same, whether you calculate your rule set, it's still the same. So that's easy enough. And so you take the inverse of 0 over 3, and that's 1. So this person, S1, has a weight of 1 between 0 and 3. Now, for S3, dropout happens, I guess, at 5. So I use this, like, parentheses to say that it's not exactly at 5. It's like a second before 5. So between 0 and just before 5, it's still 3 over 3. Because even after S1 leaves, and there's only 2 people, at 4, it's 2 over 2. And you would multiply 2 over 2 by 2 over 2, it'll still give you a 1. So I don't really update this to show. But at 5, it changes. Right? So at 5, one person drops out. So 1/2 of the people don't have dropout. So you do 3 over 3 from the prior interval by 1/2, essentially, right? You get the inverse of that, but then you set it to 0 because that's the time they drop out. So we'll just do that. So for 4, same idea. Between 0 and 5, it's 3 over 3. But then between 5 and 9, it's the 3 over 3 and the 1/2. You take the inverse of that, and that gives you the 2. And so basically what it's saying is between 0 and 5, everyone who's in the risk set represents risk themselves, essentially. After 5, they're representing themselves plus somebody else. So number 4 is representing 3. And my PhD advisor, Alvin Munoz, used to say, carrying them on their back, basically. Like, myself plus you, and it can get kind of heavy if you're representing a lot of people. And so basically, S4 represents themselves plus number 3. Because basically you're saying if 3 had stayed in, this is what their follow-up time would have been and their outcome would have been, essentially. And that is the case because S3 and S4 have the same values for LNA. And LNA are the only thing that determine when somebody censored and when somebody has the outcome. Right? And so I think this is just like a very easy way to represent it. Same calculation here, just try to make it more interesting in the interest of time. So So let's talk about S2. So this is the A equals 0, L equals 0 people. So going from here to about 4, it's 3 over 3, and then it changes at 4, essentially, because 2 of the 3 people survive, meaning that they don't drop out. So it's 2/3. And then this person gets a 0 at the time that they drop out, because they're going to be represented by the people who say there is that. So we go to number 5, same calculation, so between 4 and 11, in terms of when they're there, there's a 3 to 3 times the 2/3. It's the inverse, that's 1.5. And similar calculation for S6, between 4 and 5, they're 1.5. So essentially, between 0 and 4, everybody's a 1. Then between 5 or higher, they're 1.5. So this person, when they're between here and when they exit, they represent themselves plus half of S2. And after for S6, they represent themselves plus half of S2. Because the only thing that determines when someone drops out and has the event is L and A. So we stratify on that. So S5 and S6 are equally likely to represent S2. That's why half of S2 goes to S5 and half of S2 goes to S6. And that is all you're doing with inverse probability weighting, right? And it makes so much sense when I see it like this versus sort of like in the notation. And this comes out of, again, like this other algorithm we distribute to the right algorithm, where you're literally breaking people up based on their probability and who they look like, essentially. So if it was, for instance, you know, this person looked like S2, like maybe there was more of people who were like S5 at this point who had the event, then maybe a greater portion would go to them versus the other group. So, but it's the same idea. Yes?
On the second before that, where it says this real estate equals to 1,
Yeah.
the last column.
Yeah.
And you go down to row 2, it's real estate times 2/3, and that's 0.
Yeah.
But in the other one, it's 1.5.
Yeah, because when this person drops out, their sign is 0 weight because their weight is reflected by the people who stay. So having them have a weight would be double counting. So now I highlight this just to show that now if you were to go and just look at the event time or the exit time, and I have it bolded, it's not that bolded. So if you look at the exit times, where the death indicator is 1, the outcome indicator is 1, where there's events for person 1, person 4, and 5, and we're collapsing both of these data into one table. In terms of the number of events that happen in the related population, it essentially adds up to be 4.5. Yes. But in the observed population, you only actually observe 3 events. So you're like, where did that event come from? But basically, what's happening is that it's reweighting the population to give you the population you would have observed if dropout didn't happen. So that's why you're getting extra events, because they represent the events you would have observed if dropout didn't happen, essentially. But again, people like get a little uncomfortable. You're like, you've got events you never observed, and it's like you're making up data. So what you can do to help preserve the information, meaning the number of events, and also minimize the variability of the weight, stabilize them by including in the numerator the marginal probability of not dropping out, not conditional on anything. And so then it creates the student population had dropout been random rather than had dropout been absent. And it's random again with respect to the determinants of dropout in and out. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you can like recreate these calculations yourself. But essentially, you can get this marginal probability of dropout here in this column by basically ignoring the colors and doing the calculation again where it's like, okay, of all 6 people, did anybody drop out between 0 and 0? No. So you end up with a 6 over 6. And then you move to the next row progressively and basically get these probabilities again. So now this shows the unstabilized and the stabilized weight. And now, again, if you focus solely just on where the events happen and you add them up, you see in the weighted population where there are events, you have this one, you have this other one, so now it's, I think, 22. So then you end up with 3.1. Okay. Which is much closer to the 3 you actually observed. So it makes people a little more comfortable, right? Because it's closer, and I've done simulation to show us the 80%, and it gets you back closer. It's not going to be perfect, usually, but it gets you closer to what you would have observed. Because in this population, there is censoring happens. It just isn't, it just occurs at random, essentially. So it's a nice feature that I like about it. So this, I have this paper, the 2016 paper here, just to say that these calculations are in the appendix to the 2016 paper. If you want to wade through them, they were very painful to write. But it's a different example, but it makes the point, essentially. And I also have, from the appendix, the screenshot, which has code in it, that you use as an example from the UNC cohort that was UNC data. And I forget what the outcome is, but it's all the code there. But the limitation of that is that there's no data set because UNC can't just post data. I've only been able to do post data from UNC once, and that was for a quant paper I had to go through all the items and stuff. But usually you don't post a data set. So, and when I give talks, like workshops, and pour all this work into stuff, and then I read the reviews, and people are like, this is bad because we couldn't run anything. She got up there, literally people writing that. She got up there, and then it's cold, but I don't know how to run it. So I gave you a simulated data set that I use in my class and code that you can use so that you don't say mean things about me, despite my hard work. So,
We sent the evaluation.
okay, good. I don't know how to project this. I don't know. Okay, I just opened up some code, but it's not projecting. I don't know what's going on. But essentially, with the code that's here, you can run the data set. And you can
Let me just try pushing buttons while you.
Okay, yeah, you can run
a
the
very ineffective button.
Yeah, I should have rehearsed this earlier, but yeah, so it's just very commented code that shows you how to estimate the inverse probability of censoring weights that I just showed you by hand, because you would never do with more than the 6 people. You would never do that by hand. And so then you run that code and you run it on the data set, and you can reproduce the numbers that I had based on some simulated example, essentially. So I don't know.
I just cleared your hard drive.
Oh my God, okay. So yeah, so I just wanted to, so that, and I agree, it's nice to be able to run something, not just have people talk about it and present you code, because once you're, having a data set can actually be quite nice. I don't provide you code for how to create the data set, that's another step, but I wanted it to be a little bit more practical. In the interest of time, we're not gonna probably be able to run through some stuff, but everything is pretty well defined. There's a little mini code book in there that provides instruction. So if you encounter any difficulty, has anyone, I sent it to, I posted it, or somebody posted it on a Friday. Did anyone try to run it? How was it? Did it run? Did you get any errors? Good. Did it make sense? Okay, anybody else? Well, take a look at it. I don't know what that is.
I just put it into PowerPoint because it will only talk to PowerPoint. Apparently.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, it's really, that's so weird.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's okay. It'll take me a second. I'm not good with filling out.
Okay.
We should get. This is why we have PhD students. This was actually why we introduced the PhD program. And I don't totally understand why I'm the person up here doing this. Do you want to run from? Are you running it from here?
I was going to run it, but yeah, we can just, you don't have to continue. It's fine.
I mean, we can get AD here.
No, we don't have that much. I mean,
okay.
I'd rather spend the last 25 minutes doing something else.
So
but thank you very much for all of your hard work.
My ineffective hard work. I'm here for you. Okay.
But yeah, so I mean, so I have, okay, it's back up. Thank you. So code in the paper, that's well commented. That's like a peeve of mine when people post code that is not well commented. I'm like, I can't read it. So I try to be as commented as possible. And this is the example that the simulated data is based on. So it's the natural fun example here, RNA with that. All right, so moving forward, some necessary assumptions and conditions for estimation with given the tools that I think get glossed over, which I think are important. So as I mentioned in part one, the causal concept of interest corresponds to some joint effect, right? When you're intervening on the exposure and the sensory mechanism. And then you also, need consistency, positivity, exchangeability, correct modification. So I'm going to go into a little bit of that. So exchangeability in the concept of selection bias means that all common causes of selection and dropout in the outcome are measured appropriately. And appropriately, that's getting in this whole measurement error thing. And you also need to use the exposure needs to be accounted for in the analysis that I talk about to achieve exchangeability. And this is the equivalent of the unmeasured confounding assumption, or no unmeasured confounding. But it's an untestable assumption, and so you can perform some sensitivity analysis. And these sensitivity analysis, I think, are based on the Paul Allison book. That's his dad's book. That's really fabulous. So tell us about what you can do in the setting when you're in the time of event setting, where if you want to get some absolute estimates, or you want to get survival, you can generate upper and lower bounds by making assumptions. So to get an upper bound of survival, you assume that the dropouts. So basically, when they drop out, you assign it to the longest follow-up time, which is usually the end of the study. So you assume that the event didn't happen until the end of the study, right? So that's going to give you the highest value to survival. And then the lower bound, you get if you assume that the day they dropped out, they also had the event, right? So that's going to increase the hazard or increase or reflect the survival, and so that gives you a lower bound. And you can also get perform sensitivity analyses for unmeasured source of selection bias for the relative estimate in terms of, let's say, the hazard ratio. So you can get an upper bound if you were to look at the exposed people who dropped out, and basically assign them to have the event at the time that they dropped out. Meanwhile, the people who dropped out were unexposed, you assign them to drop out at the longest follow-up time, and that gives you the upper bound. And the lower bound is you conversely look at the people who were unexposed and dropped out, and you assign them to have the event at the time that they dropped out of the study, while the people who dropped out and were exposed are assigned to drop out at the longest follow-up time. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this just, again, allows you to get an upper and lower value and give you bounds. But a lot of times, every time I've done this, they're not informative because they include the null, and so you're like, oh, this means it could be any of these values. So oftentimes the bounds are so wide that it's not helpful, but it's in theory something that you could do. And I mentioned earlier, which I don't have here, but doing simulations to assess the degree of the selection bias, or using some of that recent work by Tyler with the closed form equations. So another issue is positivity. And so when people started first thinking about positivity, they were thinking about confounding, but it's also important in terms of selection bias. And so that was one of the points I made in the 2011 paper, and then Miguel and Jay make in their book chapter, is that there has to be a non-zero probability of the examples within every observed subset defined by the exposure and the common predictions of selection and outcome. So this is how you represent it, right? This probability has to be greater than 0. And the reason why it has to be greater than 0, it goes back to the example I gave previously, where if, again, I'm the only black woman sampled and I leave the room, there's no one who can represent me, right? So there has to be some people, some probability of people who are like me, still left in the room, who can represent me, right? Who got into the sample, had an S equals to 1. So that's why it's become important. And it's analogous to the positivity and confounding section, because now this just becomes A, and so you have to have every level of the exposure as a function of the covariance, right? Because you got to have people in the exposure unequal comparison, right? But here you don't care about both arms and selections. You don't care about people who weren't sampled. You only care about people who get in, right, and represent those people. So the equivalent here is that for the out selection is if you have a non-zero probability of not dropping out, so CT equals 0 at each observed follow-up time. So the bar is a little higher because it's not just overall non-zero probability. It's at every single follow-up time where dropout could have happened. Where you have to have, this has to be essentially greater than 0, conditioned on every observed combination of the common predictors of dropout and outcome as well as the exposure. Then, because you're usually using some parametric or semi-parametric approach to estimate the weight, model specification comes into key. You got to correct model specification. I think when I first wrote this, I was like, I don't know what I'm talking about. But so I tried to, now that I have a draft of it, try to explain it better, because I always get questions about what you mean. So it basically means that the model choice, including like the functional forms, like how you model the predictors and what model you select overall, right? So usually adhere to the assumptions of the model. So if you're using a linear regression model, are the errors normally distributed? That is the model specification that needs to be met to ensure correct specification, right? And this is true not only for the outcome model that looks at the relationship between the exposure and the outcome, but also for the weight model that looks at the relationship between the exposure, the covariance, and the selection mechanism. Right? So it's a little bit higher bar there. And in terms of assessing for violations in positivity or correct model specification, a common way to do the assessment, let's talk about in the literature, at least in terms of positivity, and I guess the specification is you look at the distribution of the weight in terms of the IPW. And so you can look at the mean of the stabilized sampling weight and the dropout weight to see if they're about 1. And if they are, then they're good to go. You can also start to sum up the stabilized sampling and dropout weight to see if they are what they should be. So in terms of the dropout weight, or no, specifically sample weight, if you sum them up and they're not very close to the original cohort size, something's not right, right? That's the hint that you have some non-positivity or that you have some incorrect model representation. So it's not going to be perfect, but you try to, get close enough essentially. And I believe, is it Meyer Peterson? Yeah, when I was a postdoc, showed this paper on dealing with on non-positivity. And it's a really good paper. It's in Stats in Medicine that talks about things that you can do to help. Usually it was kind of confounding, but I think some of this applies here in terms of like redefining what your question is, maybe collapsing some groups and things like that if it's not working. And then Miguel and Jamie in their paper talk about, Steve and Miguel talk about truncation as an approach, which I actually don't like truncation at all. But you have to literally twist my arm to do it. Because it doesn't get you a less biased answer, it just gets you a precise answer. Why do you want a more precise answer on something that's precise? But that's a whole other topic. So the last issue is in terms of consistency. So again, this is probably the hardest thing. I think I had to wrap my mind around for a while. And also, like, the language has changed. So initially when I was learning this, it was a consistency assumption. And then the data per order phase, it's not an assumption, it's a condition. It has to be. So now I switched to condition versus assumption, but I'm not necessarily sure all the kind of difference. But it's a condition. It has to hold and to do any kind of causal inference, right? And so essentially, when I talked about the causal context of interesting in relation to potential outcomes and mean potential outcomes, we're talking about intervening on the exposure and the censoring mechanism, right? And we spend a lot of time thinking about consistency in terms of the exposure, but less so in terms of the censoring mechanism. And so in order for this consistency condition to hold, which it has to, you need to be able to conceive of some intervention on C or F that you could actually do to preclude people from dropping out, or to preclude people from dying, or to preclude people from not being in the study. Which in many situations is not realistic. Like, you can't conceive of any kind of intervention that you could actually do. And so the example I use is when estimating time to death due to cancer, and persons who died due to other causes are informally censored with correction for IPW if it's preventing all other causes of death feasible. Meaning when you censor people for all other causes of death, you're basically saying you want to intervene and prevent everybody from dying from something else, right? Prevent you from dying from a car crash or some other thing. And is that realistic? Probably not, right? And so we're getting estimates for things that don't correspond to any interventions that we can actually do, and how meaningful is that, essentially. So it's an issue. I'm not even really sure what to do about it that much. There's some ideas, but I'm still not very satisfied. But I have this paper. This is one of my dissertation papers. And I remember when I was trying to do this approach, trying to estimate like overall survival or something. It was one such a problem when I was using IPW, and I needed to graduate, and I was going to go do a postdoc with Steve Cole, and I was like emailing him at 3 a.m. and he was writing me back because he wanted me to finish. I was like, this isn't working, Steve. These weights are not working. They're giving me these results that don't make any sense, and like months and months, and then eventually we were just like, I think we have. At the time, I didn't know what to call it, but it was, now we call it sort of this deterministic non-positivity. And I think a lot of people have points also to say random non-positivity. And I think you've published on some stuff like this, Maria. But basically, it's saying that like the common causative censoring and the outcome is so strong. It's like really deterministic. Like if you were censored, like you have the outcome, right? And so in a particular direction. So you can't, there's no way to recapture that because basically it's the equivalent of me being the only black woman here and somebody left. There's nobody possibly in the study or so few people in the study to represent the full distribution of the outcomes that you were not going to get the right answer. And so that's what we think happened in this example. This is the earliest published paper where we start making some of these assumptions more explicit in terms of what assumptions have to hold when you do an inverse probability or censoring rate, which are different than, a little different than when you are dealing with the exposure rate. So I would take a look at that. Yes?
What is it that turned you on to that? What did you notice?
I mean, basically, like, we were trying to estimate, like, I need the paper now. I think it was, like, AIDS-free survival. I forgot what we were trying to estimate. Like, AIDS-free survival without having taken HIV meds and going from 1996 onward. So, like, what happened in HIV, and Jeff could jump in and correct me, but basically, like, people were estimating AIDS, the natural course of HIV without treatment. Then treatment was introduced, and you couldn't estimate the natural course anymore because everyone would get prescribed if you had AIDS, right? And because AIDS was like any kind of clinical defining illness that corresponding to AIDS, you immediately get put on. And so there was no follow-up with anybody after AIDS in terms of when they would be alive or not. So the censoring was initiating antiretroviral therapy. So you censor them to get the AIDS-free survival, but that's informative censoring. You've got to fix that problem. But the censoring mechanism is so strongly related to the outcome that there's nobody left in the risk set who isn't on ART to estimate death when they're after they go of AIDS. And so so we were seeing, so the question was how many people would be AIDS-free or something, outcome-free or something, I can't remember, after 20 years. And the way that when HIV was introduced, there would be nobody who would be not on ART 20 years out. So we were getting estimates that were like 40% or something, and nobody believed, based on parametric models, that 40% of the population would still be AIDS-free without HIV medication. But we could never prove it because no such people actually exist in the world. And so I was getting estimates of like 40%, and it was just crazy, and I made it to make sense, and my mentor Albert was like, we cannot publish this is a mess. So, because it was really about the research question at the time in some ways, and then it became more about the method and like the assumption. And so I remember I presented this, and at SER, it was my first presentation ever at SER, and Sandy Zealand was a moderator, and I was like so scared that he was going to be like, this is all garbage, sit down or something, but it was fine. But it was fine, he was nice. But it was a nice example of showing like, all these fancy methods, but if the assumptions aren't met, you are not going to get the right answer per se, and just highlighting that. Because we do a lot of things and either don't think through the assumptions, don't know the assumptions, and they're really important because they provide a context for our interpretation. And they can tell you when something's not right. either your code's messed up or some assumption is not met. So I kept checking my code. I was like, something's wrong with my code, Steve. I don't know, you know. So he was really nice about it, but you know, it ended up getting published, and it's one of my most highly cited papers, actually. So I guess all the pain and suffering was worth it. Yes.
I have a question about consistency.
Yeah.
So, my understanding is that the consistency with respect to exposure is that you want a consistent definition of exposure across all the units that they expose.
Yes.
So,
Sort of. Yeah, yeah. So basically, you, in the context of like confounding issues, or not confounding, with exposure, you're basically saying that you want a version of the exposure where everyone uniformly has the event or the same outcome, essentially, right? But if you have multiple versions of that particular exposure, then if you were to do an intervention to make people exposed, you may get a different outcome than you actually expected because you didn't have the right version. But yeah, so it's the same idea where it needs to be well defined as something you can actually do, because Miguel makes a big point about having interventions or causal questions or theoretical interventions that correspond to real world interventions that you could actually do. Because we could do all the theoretical interventions that you want and get results, but none of those results may correspond to what you actually see if you could actually do the experiment.
the exposure or the intervention has to be well defined. That's what.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm thinking after out selection,
Yeah.
the definition of out selection has to be well defined across the scope.
Yeah.
Would that be the definition?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's like analogous in the sense that there could be, if you just say censoring, that's very broad, but there could be different mechanisms for censoring, and each mechanism could correspond to a different type of intervention, and some interventions can be more realistic than others. And so, the result that you get may be different depending upon what censoring mechanism that you hypothetically are intervening on. And then there's a whole other issue of could you actually do this kind of intervention too, right? Like if there's no possible intervention that you can do, then is it really worthwhile to actually think about questions that correspond to interventions that are impossible? And that's a whole debate in of it. So I think it can still be worked on some setting. In the health theory setting, but I think it's really about. Okay. So, all right. So another question that I get often is, why do we even need IBW? Let's just do adjustment and stratify and go home because it's so easy and nobody has to worry about relating people. And so this is an example I think taken from that 2004 paper where you have some exposure, an outcome, someone measures you, and you measure the covariate L, and then you have conditioning on sampling and dropout. And so for this, you have selection bias because L is a collider, and you're conditioning on the extension of the collider. And so if you were to just control for the selection bias with what you have measured, controlling for L isn't doing anything else for you. Essentially, you still have selection bias. It doesn't do anything. So, but what you could do with IPW is remove this arrow, and then you no longer have quite a stratification bias. And so there are many settings, a lot of settings, where actually you can't use standard regression adjustment, and you have to do IPW to get the job done for some other two methods. So essentially, the general take-home is that you examine the DAG, and you identify what paths need to be blocked and conditioning with arrows, and then that's how you inform what approach you should use. And then this slide, a lot of notation. So this is what the stabilized weight for out selection looks like. So oftentimes you have to be controlling for exposure and confounding bias. So you have two sets of weights, and as we expressed in this equation, which are joint probabilities, so then you can also be expressed into the conditional probabilities that multiply over time, which I have here. So essentially, if there's no confounding, right, there's no common causes of A on the outcome, then L, covariate doesn't predict A. So whether or not you use L to predict the probability of A isn't going to change that probability, so you essentially cancel out, and you can just focus on this, right? But we're still interested in the effect of some exposure, nobody was censored, right? From this equation, you can actually see that in order to get the censoring weight properly estimated, you have to use the exposure. I like didn't understand. So he explained it. And so this equation inherently just means that because you're estimating joint effect, right, you need to use the exposure in addition to the covariance to predict the probability of selection, essentially. If this is not here, even if A does not predict selection, well, even if A, even if there's no confounding of L, sorry, the exposure, and even if, even if A predicts selection, but you don't remove the arrow from A to L. So let me give you the example. Let's see, what is the example that I've been using? Yeah, so this is the example. So even if, and ignore the condition here. So even if you were in this diagram and you were to just remove the arrow from L to C. And initially when I was working through this problem, I thought, oh, all I have to do is just estimate the probability weight as a function of L and not a function of A at all. But that gives you the wrong answer because you're estimating the joint effect. And from that prior equation, you have to use A also to predict dropout, even if you don't end up removing the arrow from A to C. So you have to use it in the prediction, and that's most likely shown in this equation here. Like you have to. So in this equation, because A is in the numerator denominator, the arrow from A to L is preserved. From A to selection is preserved. It doesn't get removed. Only the arrow from L to selection is removed because L is only in the denominator. Right? So you can get the right answer. Or you can get the right answer if this is just a marginal probability, not as a function of A. And then that means you remove the arrow from A and L in the selection. But you won't get the right answer if A is not either in the numerator or the denominator. It has to at least be in the denominator to get the right answer. And I teach this to my class, and the students are, I showed them an example where you just use it based on L, and they're like, why is the result off? Like, it's simulated data, so I know the truth. And it's because of this joint effects issue, which is a big deal, but like I didn't realize, And again, it was one of those things where y'all knew, and it told me 5 seconds, but like I feel like a lot of people didn't know, so that's why I wanted to make that more explicit in the 2016 paper. So this is true for censoring as well as selection. So with 2 minutes, the summary is for part 2 is that various tools of the design and analysis phase can be used to minimize both absolute and relative in and out selection bias. And tools such as standard regression adjustment and IPW, if you're going to use them, you should know what assumptions and conditions must be met for them to work. And that may take some data analysis, exploring whether, do you have actually a non-zero probability and confirming that, and doing some other things. So, with 1 minute to spare, that's it. Thank you guys so much for sitting through this. I have my email here if you want to contact me afterwards, or you can ask me a question now or after this immediately. I know I'm meeting with some people, so you can ask me then. But I hope this was helpful and useful to you, and that's it.
Thank you. That was terrific. You're welcome. I'm sorry that we don't have time to run code, but they have the code. So.
Yeah. It was fine.
Okay, so we have to go to another building for lunch.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Okay, so I will just